Thank you. Welcome. My name is Jacob Nadal. I'm Director for Preservation here at the Library of Congress. Situated near the confluence of the Potomac and Anacostia rivers, the Library of Congress acknowledges the sovereignty of the native nations of the United States. We pay our particular respect to the people, past and present, of the Nacotchtank or Anacostan, the Piscataway, Pamunkey, and Mahanahoic nations, the first peoples and custodians of the land where we meet today. This project has been an enormous undertaking. Being able to continue this research through the pandemic was a challenge, and I want to thank the Mellon Foundation for their patience and flexibility, and thank you to our partners for pulling and shipping books to feed this analytic machine the past several years. Getting to work up close with collections from the partner libraries, Cornell University, University of Miami, University of Washington, Arizona State University, and University of Colorado at Boulder has been incredible, and I'm looking forward to your panel discussion this afternoon. It was an actual decade ago that Ian Bogus pulled a group together at Penn to talk about retention thresholds from a preservation viewpoint, and I hope you'll all join me in thanking him for guiding this work through many incarnations over that time. This group has conducted literature reviews and surveys, developed risk assessment models, tested those risk models in papers of varying degrees of controversy, and eventually developed enough momentum to make this Assessing the National Collection project a reality. Together, you not only helped create an unprecedented data set, you also provided opportunities for people. As this project developed, the team in PRTD deserves credit for turning staffing challenges into opportunities, so a more diverse group of budding scientists could gain practical experience through working on this project. This is one of the largest collection surveys ever contemplated, and I don't know of any others that have been able to bring this level of analysis to bear. The data collected, as you'll see throughout the morning, is complex and plentiful. They give us a much more nuanced picture of the first century of manufactured books. You all know the highlights. The project compared the physical, chemical, and optical characteristics of a selection of library materials across 5 large research libraries, each in distinct regions of the United States. The project compared the same titles and editions to quantify and objectively assess the condition of these volumes. This project gives us a more robust basis for understanding how materials age and deteriorate, and a better understanding of how good quality and poor quality copies of books will fare over time. We set out to develop this knowledge base to aid in retention and withdrawal decisions, and to help us plan for appropriate storage and care. There's good information here for those purposes. But I admit I'm still a little wide-eyed at what I've seen so far. I mostly handle scripted remarks and spreadsheets these days, but I've had thousands of books like the ones from ANC pass through my hands during my career. I was not sure there was much to learn. Talking with Fenella as this data has accrued, however, I started reflecting on how the Book Traces project led us to rethink the so-called general collections. This first century of book manufacturing is inseparable from a century of social transformation. I'm starting to rethink what we can learn when we bring this material science knowledge into the conversation. I find myself wondering who printed the works of abolitionists, suffragists, Pan-Africanists, all contemporary movements to ANC. I'm wondering if there's another dimension of history to be found. As I say this, please consider your source. I am not a scholar, but a preservation director with an interest in job security for me and my people. Yet time and again, I see how better history emerges when we bring a conservator's eye view and heritage scientists into historiography. A lot of books and documents were right there under the pen and printing plate in the proverbial rooms where it happened. More comfortably, back on my own turf when I reflect on the century these works are a witness to, I am bringing a different mindset to thinking about their preservation. We're right now working with partners from the W.E.B. Du Bois Museum Foundation on a project that also owes some thanks to Mellon Foundation. Du Bois's personal library in his bungalow in Accra has a particular significance that comes from being in his hands and in that place. Those materials are all from this same period in book manufacturing, but my stock answer for them, pack them up, move them to environmentally optimized storage, is not just impractical in Accra, it runs counter to the meaning of that type of museum. The data we have from ANC gives me some hope. This is a help to large research library shared print efforts and preservation programs, giving us potential for better forecasts and a better ability to forecast for important subsections of the collective collection. But I hope this work also sets the stage for more nuanced preservation thinking that can apply to a wide range of contexts to the good of a lot of collections. We look forward to sharing the results and outcomes of this with you today through the 2 sessions this morning and this afternoon. And with that, let me hand it over to Fenella. Thank you.
Thank you, Jake. I'm going to hand over to Ian Bogus, who will give the background of, as you've heard, 10 years of work. And just thank you all for being here. And I believe we've got 80 to 100 online as well. Huge thanks to you all joining us, I know, from various different time zones. So thank you for staying up late or getting up early in the morning. Ian.
Just going to make sure I know how to do this. Got it. Thank you. Hi, my name's Ian Bogus. It's a real privilege to be with all of you here today. As Jake said, this is a real personal project to myself and a variety of the other people who you'll be hearing about today who have been working on this for quite some time. So about 10 years from the inception all the way through today. So it was really, really exciting for myself, and I know many of the other people, to presenting what have we been doing and how we hope this to help librarianship overall. Let me start a little bit about talking about what was happening about 10 years ago. So 10 years ago, there was a concept that was really gaining steam in librarianship called shared print. This is an idea where libraries can start working much more closely together to figure out how to have better collection management outcomes and preservation outcomes. And essentially how it would work is libraries would make what are called retention commitments to particular books, promising that they would keep them around, and also promising that they would lend them to libraries within their network. Now, many of us in the preservation field had some concerns about how this would go and how we would make sure that we were being responsible with retaining our collections and managing them over time. So the map up here on the upper right-hand side is a map that came from a library nonprofit called OCLC, and they were doing some thinking about the national collection in the United States. And this map represents essentially where collections are stored. Not surprisingly, the coastal regions have most of the collections, especially on the East Coast. But the West Coast has quite a bit, the South has a lot, and the Chicago area also has quite a bit of materials. As we were talking through some of this, we were trying to think through, well, what do we know about collections as a whole? And we have a very good idea about how temperature and humidity affects the degradation of paper. So one of the things that we were playing with is this map here on the bottom. And what that is a map that we made. It's a representation of the average temperatures in the United States and the average humidities. And this got us thinking, what if we could make some predictions about the condition of collections based on where they were stored, or what type of libraries, or something along those lines, and how that could really help us think through how we could make good advice for libraries thinking through this. So one of the people I started talking about this with was a gentleman named Tom Clareson. He works for a consortium called Lyrasis. Tom and I had several conversations, and we thought that it was a good idea in order to suggest a research project. So we convinced the preservation section at ALA in order to give us some time to talk with people. So our initial plan was we would take about half that time, present what we had been talking about personally, and then move to a discussion. So the truth of the matter is after about 15 or 20 minutes, the 150 or so people in the audience had a lot of questions and started talking it through, and we decided to put aside the rest of our slides and see where that conversation went, which was exactly what we wanted to do. I mean, we wanted to start a dialogue. These couple quotes here, as I was going through my notes in preparation for today, they just stood out to me as threads of what we'll be hearing about for the rest of the day. One of them is, well, how do we know how many copies do we need? How do we even determine that? And the second was a similar project called the Identical Book Project that happened in the UK. And this was a foundational study. It was super important, where in the UK they were bringing a whole bunch of materials, same titles together, to try to get a better understanding about how they aged. Now, one of the issues that they ran into is that they were using a bunch of different labs to do the testing, and getting all of those synced enough in order to really line them up proved to be difficult. So Fenella and Andrew will talk a little bit about what we learned from some of this moving forward. At the end of this day, Tom and I kind of walked away feeling a little bit overwhelmed but encouraged. It was clear that a lot of people were interested in this type of project and felt it was necessary, but we needed more time in order to really get into the issues. So about 6 months later, we hosted a summit at the University of Pennsylvania, where I was working at the time. It was about, I think, about 4 or 5 hours. And this quote here on the top is from the materials that we sent participants. And you can see, again, the starting of the threads of ANC coming through. We want to talk about a regional study that could be used in order to make predictive generalizations about condition to help give advice to libraries. In many ways, it had some similarities to that first form that we put up. We had a day kind of well-structured. We had several activities set up in order to facilitate conversation. And after about the second activity, the 30 or 35 participants had already generated so much information and so many ideas that we decided to kind of put aside the rest of the day and continue that thread. For me, this was a really important lesson. It's helpful and important to make sure that you prepare well for these types of things. But it's even more important in order to recognize when you need to put aside your plans and see where those discussions go. So at the end of the day, Tom and I hoped to have a project, convince people enough that we needed to do something. And the truth of the matter is at the end of the day, there were really two things that the group thought was really important to do. The first was, how do we make criteria for making responsible decisions? And the second one was, what is the information that we need in order to help influence that? How do we do a regional study that can provide data about if predictive generalizations can be made? And I think that was one of the big questions on our side, is that the key word there is if and how. So these were two really, really big projects, and in many ways required different expertise. So what we did is we actually formed two teams that were interrelated. So we had a science team. This is the first iteration of that team that was thinking about and designing what would end up being the ANC project. I'm not going to talk a lot about what this team did. The rest of today is about where that project went. I will talk about what the retention group had done and what the context is and how that relates to ANC. Now, we did not view these two groups as totally independent. What would happen is the groups would go off and they'd meet and they'd talk about their issues, and then about once a month or 2 months, they would come together and share where they were talking about. And that truly was an opportunity for them to kind of influence each other and have the projects grow together in a way that really bolstered both of them. So the first thing this retention group did is we wanted to get a much better understanding about how libraries were making withdrawal decisions. So we designed a study in 2014 and 2015. We got respondents from about 99 libraries, most of them ARL libraries, which are the large research libraries in the United States, but also quite a few from Oberlin Group libraries, which are the smaller liberal arts college libraries. The results were presented in full at the 2015 Charleston Conference. You can look up all of those slides, but I do just want to hit a couple highlights that I think, again, pull a thread all the way through our work. One of the questions that we had was, what's in your monographic withdrawal policy? Most libraries, especially at this time, books may get withdrawn through what's called a preservation review. A book is identified as damaged either through circulation or some other means. Someone would get it and have to make a decision about what to do with it. Are you going to keep it? Are you going to repair it? Are you going to try to replace it? So not surprisingly, that came up quite frequently as a criteria that people would use. Duplicate print copies in the library was also a really, really big criteria. Also not surprising is availability of other types of copies, whether they be digital or replacement copies, were common selection criteria. But there were a couple things that we weren't totally prepared to see, at least at this time, that we thought would be growing, one of which is a little less than 20% of libraries were already starting to think about mass withdrawal projects. We felt this was probably coming because of where shared print potentially was going. But also we weren't prepared for about 30% of libraries that were making decisions based on copies that were held in member libraries of consortia that they were members of. Again, this was one of the things that shared print can help with, but already, almost 10 years ago, people were starting to think about this. We also wanted to know what information was lacking. If there was information available to you that would help make these decisions, what would those things be? 90% of libraries said if we could see retention commitments and other libraries, that would be a large factor in our decision-making practice. Back when we did this study, that information really wasn't available. I can tell you today, over the past few years, it is now. And libraries are starting to use that in order to understand what they need to hold on to and what they may be able to divest themselves of. A couple other things which also were factors is if there was a way to see the condition of books at other libraries, that very well may be a criteria they would use. And about 25% of libraries or so said that if there was an easy, quick test for their book that would tell them about how much life is left in there, they very well may use that also. We didn't ask them, but I suspect those two categories are a little bit lower just because of the amount of time it takes. Libraries were really starting to think about mass projects at this time, and going through individual books is not really feasible when you're doing that. Lastly, we also asked, if you're divesting yourself of a book, would you be willing to send it to another library? The reason we were asking this question is if we could make a generalization and a library was and we knew that that library had good condition books that we felt were needed in order to preserve the title overall, would they think about sending it to a library that might be able to take it? 85% of libraries in one form or another said that they would be willing to do that, which I think was very, very encouraging. And in fact, a little less than 25% of libraries said they were already doing it, and that wasn't something that we knew. At this stage, we wanted to get a good understanding about how these shared print programs were forming. They had been forming for a few years at this time. So we did what we considered an informal review of the MOUs for these shared print programs. We intentionally looked at what was publicly available because we wanted to see not the interpretation of what libraries said were in the MOUs, we wanted to see what was actually in there. We looked at about 15 programs. 9 of them articulated in the MOU what their retention agreements were, and only 2 of those were permanent retention commitments, by which I mean a library would say, I'm holding on to these things forever on behalf of our partnership. The rest of them had terms, 10 years, 20 years, maybe 30 years. And then they would expire, and then there was a decision of whether or not to recommit or to do something else. Only about 6 of the programs had withdrawal policies. This was actually one of the things that we thought was important to have in an MOU. Libraries have to make decisions, and sometimes things throw them through a loop. Having an understanding and sharing what the process was for removing a book we felt was important, although wasn't really well represented in the MOUs themselves. Lastly, none of them had meaningful environmental guidelines for storing these books. So when I say meaningful environmental guidelines, I usually am saying, what type of temperature and humidity, those types of controls, in order to try to extend the life of materials. I think a couple of them had vague language like good quality environment. My personal experience is some people in libraries interpret a good quality environment as a roof, but the walls may be optional. We want to be a little bit more specific when we're talking about trying to retain things over time. At this stage, we had a really good idea about how libraries were making withdrawal decisions. We had an idea about how these shared print programs were forming and what they were trying to do. And we thought we had a pretty good idea also about what are the factors that influence our ability nationally to retain our written history, at least in the United States. So we wrote a paper called Everything Not Saved Will Be Lost. It came out in 2019. In a lot of ways, it was a weird paper. It didn't answer a lot of questions. We viewed it as a call to arms. What it really did is it said, here's a lot of factors. Librarianship needs to figure these things out, or we could potentially have some problems. So one of the big goals was how many copies do we need to keep? We identified a variety of variables that, I don't know if I can actually use the pointer, a variety of variables that influence how many copies we think we need, and then also a variety of policies that need to be settled to make sure that they're not really throwing things out of whack. At this stage, several things were going on. First off, this group had been working pretty hard for about 5 years straight, and some of the members needed to roll off and focus their time in other areas. Secondly, there was another organization that was forming called the Partnership for Shared Book Collections. That is a confederation of shared print programs that was intending in order to not only promote shared print, but also provide good responsible decision-making practices and advice for libraries and consortia. So one of the big things they were doing is working on these policy sections. They also formed a research group in order to figure out how to get information for things that they needed, which included kind of what was called a risk group. They were trying to figure out where shared print could mitigate their risks for collections as a whole. So what we did is we actually kind of merged together. Some of our members stayed on. We had a variety of new people come onto our group that really gave us a diversity of librarianship. Previously, it was mostly preservation folks. And at this stage now, we're bringing in some collections people in some other areas that was really helping us think through some of this. So we reviewed that paper, and we looked at where we could find some data that would support some of those variables and where we were lacking. One of the big areas that was lacking is what's called bibliographic inaccuracy. So libraries were making decisions based on their bibliographic records. What items to commit to, what items they might withdraw based on what other libraries had, and there was a big question about how accurate are those records? Can we trust that the book in hand and the record itself match in a significant way? So we did a study. It was important for us to get a lot of data relatively quickly, so that way we could provide advice. Again, at this stage, libraries are starting to withdraw their copies based on commitments in shared print programs. And what we found out is that when a patron goes to a library and says that they need a book, but their library locally doesn't carry it, they get that book through an interlibrary loan system. So they borrow it from a second library. During that process, what happens is a staff member gets the book, and they look at the bibliographic record, and they look at the book, and they see whether or not they actually fulfilled the request. This was exactly the information that we needed in order to get. So we got about 13 libraries for a period of time to only record when they didn't match. We called them mismatches. They looked at about 30,000 items, so it was a pretty big data set. And overall, the findings were pretty interesting. So out of the 13 libraries, only 4 of them actually found mismatches during that period of time. There was about 29 or 30 mismatches in total. 2 of those libraries recorded general information like the title didn't match, but didn't say what about the title didn't match. And 2 of them said specifically, this is what we found, here are the 2 records, take a look at it yourself. So about half of the 30 we could actually see. And the really interesting thing from our side is that most of those things still did not cause confusion about the books in hand. So one of the common things that we found were printing date differences. The book was initially published in 1980. It was printed in 1981. Bibliographically, it is exactly the same thing. OCLC, which is where our shared cataloging happens, says put them all on the same record. That doesn't really cause confusion about the item itself bibliographically. The other thing that we found quite commonly is that there were small differences in normalizations in titles or authors that also did not make a big difference. So things like the book said I bogus and the record said Ian bogus. Our instructions were to write down differences. They wrote down the difference. There's still not any confusion that I wrote that book. We also found some things where there was just typos or small omissions, like an article left off of a title. We did not remove those things from that 0.1%. So we found 0.1% of records were identified as having differences. We kept that in there. This paper's been accepted for publication. It's not out yet. It'll probably be out in about a year. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts when that does come out. At this stage, we found at least some places to find some data for most of those variables. And we sat down with an industrial engineer at UC Berkeley. Her name was Dr. Candice Yano. And she helped us develop a model for how many copies do we need to keep in the United States. This paper comes out in a month. So you can read that and call me up. I'm easy to find and tell me what we did wrong. We'd be happy to hear that. I want to go through relatively quickly about what is in this model and how that relates to the project writ large today. So we have about 4 variables that go into this. The first is, what is the chance that a book actually is on the shelf where you think it's going to be? The Eastern Scholars Trust did a massive study. We actually got a lot of data from them, and one of the things they looked at was how often is a book not on the shelf. And they looked at about 316,000 books in about 50 some odd libraries. One of the things that was surprising to us is that they found a very consistent 3% of books are not on the shelf. They did they gathered data in 2016 and 2017, and you can see almost immediately, almost 3% of books were on the shelf. And that stayed pretty consistent all the way back to the first half of the 19th century. This was a little surprising to us, and of course there was some variation library to library, but honestly there wasn't as much variation as we thought there would be. It was a pretty strong 3% overall. The second criteria is bibliographic inaccuracy. I'm not going to go back over that, I just talked about it, but it certainly is a factor in the model that we created. Third is annual loss rate. This is the idea that books do erode out of our collections over time. This is the only variable that compounds year after year. One of the things that we found really interesting about this is we could not find any meaningful data about actual measurable attrition in libraries. So when I worked in a library, I would get copied on messages from circulation to the bibliographers saying these books are not coming back, and there might be a few hundred books a year that weren't coming back. Some of those would get replaced, but as we talk this through, I mean, many of my colleagues had the same experience. There might be a couple hundred books on those lists every year, but those were in collections of several million. And when you try to understand what is the likelihood that any individual copy would be lost, it becomes such a small percentage, it's really hard to calculate. So it is in the model. We actually have a stand-in for it, but we didn't actually find a meaningful annual attrition rate in libraries. Lastly is physical deterioration over time. This by far was the biggest factor on whether or not we're able to hold on to titles in libraries. This graph is just a representation of how temperature and humidity affects paper degradation. It's done out of the Canadian Conservation Institute. They just used standard papers and looked at through accelerated aging, how does that degradation work? In the model, we actually have two spots where this ends up factoring in. The first is, what is the chance that a book is usable today? And the second is, what is the chance that we think that a book will be usable sometime in the future? So this is essentially what the model looks like. I'm not going to go through it in depth, but basically it's two mathematical formulas. The one on the left tells you, if you know the values to all of those variables, what is the probability that a book will be usable when you need it, or at least what that during a horizon that you set. And the second formula, the one on the right, is say you have several copies of a single title, and even if the variables for each copy differ, what is the likelihood that at least one of those copies will survive at the end of that horizon? And this brings us back to the ANC project. A lot of the information that we have had, that we currently have, is through accelerated aging. A lot of it also is kind of some data that was available to us, but imperfect. And the ANC project really allows us to understand much better what is happening in libraries using real life materials and practically we can get a much better understanding about how many copies do we need to hold on to nationally. And this is, from my opinion, the real value in research like this. We can start using it in order to allow real practical decisions in libraries. So with that in mind, I'm gonna actually hand it over to Fenella. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to have you all here, and really great to see that background of, and also a little daunting to think that we've been doing this for 10 years, but that's where we're at. So I do want to, as Jake noted, give a call out to the Mellon Foundation. They were incredibly supportive and adaptable throughout the pandemic. Also, Jake Nadal helped support us in being able to keep the program moving forward. I sort of pleaded to him, it's like, we've got contractors, how do we keep this moving forward? And Andrew Davis and Robin Hodgkins are both here, and they were incredible at working through that time period where we just didn't know if we touched it, who could we do and what went on. And this originally came in under the scholarly program a component and moved into public knowledge, which I think fits really nicely to what we did, like preserving original source materials, how do we support the innovative platform to share that information, and thinking about the impact on other collections that are more at risk as well. So you've heard bits of this, and I know many of you already know this very well, but really what is the information we need in terms of understanding how to make those informed decisions? And you've heard a lot from Jake and also Ian already. We took the same 500 books from 5 different research libraries in 5 different climatic zones, and we wanted to see what do they look like. And it's great to have our partners here today who also, I just want to give a huge shout out. When we were like, we need books, what do we do this? And just them and their partners pulling books from various locations, absolutely phenomenal. And we couldn't have done it without you also. Thank you so much. So really, we really wanted to start to see what's happening with the at-risk, what does this mean in terms of the model of the data, and where do we start with all of this? So why this time period, and just some background, for I know we've got a lot of people online who may not know all of this that's so familiar to all of us. Of course, this is a time period we're moving from rag, pure cotton, good quality paper to poorer quality paper with the wood pulp, and also an explosion in terms of productivity and the publication. So the 1840 to 1940 time period allowed us to really see what's happening in this time period where we're moving to a material that is less consistent than it was historically. Our research partners, as I have called out, Cornell, Miami, Washington, Arizona State, and University of Colorado at Boulder. Selecting the same volumes, and we had some pretty amazing spreadsheets, and a huge call out here to Ian. Ian started with pulling 3,000 to 4,000 volumes that were consistent across all of our partners. And then we had to say, because these were general collection books, what in each person's library is actually general collection and not a special or a unique, and is this the same volume, and do you have it, and can you find it? And so this has been a worksheet that we were joking a little bit before that we were already remote, so once we went into the pandemic, we just became slightly more adept at being remote. But the spreadsheet was integral to sort of getting a feel for what was there, what could be shipped, and what volumes did we have, and what did that look like. We started and thought about initially to have a random sample. We'll take the 4,000, we'll take 500 from that, and what does that look like? But we realised, in fact, we really needed to do a stratified random sample where we looked at those subgroups, and we did that by decade because certain decades had less books in them. So we really wanted to make sure we were getting a good representation from each decade. As you'll hear some of the research this afternoon and from Dr. Andrew Davis and Dr. Andrew Forsberg, that it's even more nuanced than that. But really, we wanted to make sure that we were getting a good percentage of books from all of those different subcategories so that we could get a good feel for what was happening in terms of assessing the condition. So when we start to look at big collections and large collections, there's sort of the 3 factors we always think about, the use or the handling, and I always joke with my colleagues in museums, I'm like, you don't know you're alive. In libraries and archives, people handle our collections, and so, we had that added component. We don't just put things on exhibit. What's the environment and what's the material? And we kind of flipped that because what we were doing here is we were looking at the text block. We were looking at what information was on the interior of the book. I will give a shout out to Susie, who strongly influenced our decision at the beginning to take captured images of all of the bindings and the covers, and we've got a huge amount of photo documentation, which I think is probably enough for about 4 other research projects that we won't get to today. But really, what can we tell from that material, the text block itself, and how does that relate to environment and usage? One of the big challenges, I think it was already mentioned by Ian, but it's very hard to get consistent environmental data because collections, as you all know, move from one space to another space, or the logger data didn't get captured, or it moved somewhere else, or you just brought it in from another location. So trying to get that specific environmental information for each volume was really challenging. The usage too, how do we measure that? Is one sign out for a professor who puts it on his bookshelf just so it's there, is that considered usage? Or if a student uses it and, to paraphrase Susie again, drops it in the bath, that could potentially have more damage than the one that's sitting on a shelf, but they're both one usage. So how do we factor that in? So we really wanted to flip the narrative to, we get to take a sample from a general collection book. What can the paper itself tell us? And Dr. Andrew Forsberg will go into a little bit more detail about those components. What we wanted to do was see where people were. So we wanted to traverse this from that subjective assessment of, I'm looking at this volume and I think it's in pretty good condition, and what does that mean, to how do we start to objectively think about what materials are at risk. And we discovered that there wasn't a consistent assessment form that everyone was using. So our kick-off meeting, and as Ian noted, sometimes letting plans go out the window, we ended up having a very long discussion about what that assessment should be and what it would look like. So adaptability, as all of the partners and everyone in PRDD knows, has been a huge factor within this project. This goes this way, let's move that way. So we wanted to really think about that knowledge. What did we already know? You've heard a little bit from Ian already about, can we trust the catalogue information and what that means in terms of bibliographic? But we wanted to think about how we're using that knowledge effectively for making those retention decisions. So as part of that, we created a visual terminology. We came up with specific categories, and as I said, Andrew F. will go into that in more detail. But we wanted also to minimise differences between how researchers are capturing that information and reviewing and assessing that. And that has been we learnt a lot from past studies, and we really wanted to make sure that any data that we were capturing, we thought through the nuances of the variability between researchers, between different people's assessment, and how we could make that very useful. So from that, we had a round robin, and many thanks to PRTD staff who were involved in that, where we realised some categories were relatively simple to give us information. Things, when it came to colour, went right out the window. We gave the same 10 books, and we had everything from white to creamishly yellow just within 10 staff, and I'm seeing some staff smiling at the memories of that. And the terms we captured were for this project. So it was to look at the levels of damage, condition or deterioration that would help us more effectively, objectively take subjective data and start to think about what that meant in a more standardised way. I also want to give a shout out to, as you can see, we're thinking about a lot of different things. So if we're using a term to describe what's already out there, so we really wanted to look at linked open data, what existing standardised ontologies or controlled vocabularies were already out there that we could link to. And so the Getty AAT, a lot of these other ones, this is where I had to, again, make an adaptation from, there's got to be one ontology out there that'll have all of these terms right, to no, we sort of have to make together a knowledge organisation system across where we take 4 different ontologies and then start to say, we will draw from these. We also had to look to see what actually was online but was being updated, because sometimes there were great ontologies but they had not been updated for 15 years, so it really wasn't linked open, true linked open data. From this, we then captured images that represented what those descriptive terms meant, and this was really useful. You'll see later the amazing amount of interns, but it was really helpful for us saying, for this project, how we defined a lot of foxing, a little foxing, and some of those amount components, we ended up looking to medical for many of those because they just don't exist in terms of science in the cultural heritage arena. It's just not there. And one of our interns then started to take the terms and the images, and we really can get this together. And we have a current intern who's working with us to get this onto the webpage, front-facing. So correlating that visual assessment with the testing, this is where we wanted to think about what we can describe in terms of visually, because that's where everyone is at, and then how do we take that to finally into the lab. So we have the physical and chemical testing. That's something like strength or acidity. That's a lot more intuitive, isn't it, right? Like when you rip a piece of paper, one rips easily, one doesn't. The optical is, the non-invasive is much better because we're not taking a sample, but how can we start to correlate things that are non-invasive with the physical testing? And the test methods also, we had to think, and this was a long period of time, going back to 2015, as Ian was saying, we were starting to look at how do we miniaturize some of these test methods that sometimes took a couple of pages, but we really couldn't ask the partners for 2 pages out of a general collection book. Even Susie, no matter how much they damage it, right? That was a wee bit much. So the partners approved a we had a long discussion. We took a 3/8" strip, just around about 10mm strip, off of the edge of 1 page of a general collection book. The caveat was that there would never be any writing or annotation on that. We would take the same page as close as possible from every volume so that we really could compare the same with same. And the test methods that we did from that 10mm strip off 1 page, usually the smallest was about 110 centimetres. Sorry, I'm just blanking on going between my metric and the test there in terms of length. But the first test one we did, the destructive, was the mini tensile. Usually tensile takes up to 10 strips of about 5 or 6 inches long to get that. We now took this down to a 10 by 10 millimetre off that strip, and tiny teaser, we did both directions just because you can. The acidity or the pH, generally again, 2.5 pages, and some of you might have seen the wonderful sped up video of Megan and Elizabeth prepping. There's an awful lot of sample prep, and believe me, if you can take micro punches rather than cut up 1.5 pages, there's a lot of nods for people who have done this, it makes it a lot simpler. Size exclusion chromatography, this is where we're looking at just taking a tiny biopsy, sometimes not bigger than a large full stop, and looking at the chain length of the cellulose. It's a very minimal sampling where you can start to think about how is the molecular weight of that originally long cellulose chain changing over time, because as it degrades, the chain will become shorter, and so you'll see a lot of that data later. And that's, some of our colleagues have looked at that as well, for looking at how we can link that to reduction in strength and assess what when the collection item is no longer fit for purpose. And so, as you'll start to see in this afternoon, generally pH, okay, we've got a measure, it's a single point, but when we're looking at tensile strength or even size exclusion chromatography, we have multiple parameters. We have the stress, we have the strain, we have the elongation, all of these parameters were captured to see would one of those be better than another for some of these prediction methods. So I think you're starting to see there's an awful lot of data building up, even just from one sample. The non-invasive tests were infrared spectroscopy, where we can take a spectra, looking at the infrared data, and seeing what's happening with the molecules, the chemicals itself. Less intuitive with all of these little peaks and squiggles, but you'll see some of the amazing work from Dr. Andrew Davis this afternoon. And the visible, ultraviolet or visible spectroscopy, what are we starting to see in terms of the colorimetry, the change across time on some of those volumes. So here we see Robin with the Fourier transform infrared. You can see lots of those peaks. You can imagine that if you start looking at those, you go a little bit cross-eyed, and it's like you'd spend a lot of time staring at these peaks and still then go, well, maybe that one's important, but what about that one? So you'll see some of the great work this afternoon that takes all of that data and makes a lot of interesting work out of it. And again, the fibre optic reflectance spectroscopy, again, with like some of those peaks are really helpful for telling us if we see this peak, that means a certain type of degradation. Let's follow that and see if that's going to be useful going forward. So why did we do destructive and non-invasive? Because, as I said, the destructive are more intuitive, they provide a more direct measure, but it takes more time to capture the data, and we can't really just rip all of these things out of books. It's just not a good thing. So linking these to the non-invasive and the optical starts to lead us into tools down the road that can really help us understand more about what's going on with the data and what's happening with the collection samples, the collection items, particularly those that can't be sampled. We'll talk more about this later on, but as I said, this was a general collection book. A lot of this time period, as Jake noted, are collections that are more at risk and can be directly correlated with the type of material components that we're seeing in these papers. So we've got all these visual terms, as we said, and how do we start to think about linking those with the lab testing? So we also want to think about, can we take some of that visual data and take some of our simple tools, and I'll do a shout out to the wonderful display that staff have put over to the right of the room there. One of the things, as you saw from one of Ian's slides too, people said, is there like a simple test we can do that will really help us know quickly what the condition of this collection item is, and then we can do that and share it with partners, or we know that if someone else is doing the same test, then we can share this data and know that we can be relatively consistent and hopeful about the fact that theirs is good and or poor condition. So the stack test needed to be inexpensive, it needed to be quick, and it needed to be simple. And these are some of the things that we've been looking at throughout the time period. Is the double fold, some of you will know. Spot tests, which are very subjective, but we were looking to see are there some that are more consistent than others. Page bending, I just want to give a shout out to Paddy McGeegan, who's done some amazing work on that. And then volatiles profiling, you know, can we sniff the box and get a feel for the breadth of the collection and what that means. Ian also noted that we wanted to make sure that whatever was happening over time was something that we could control and be comfortable with. Some of the other large studies, and I will say studies that go for a long period of time, there's a lot of factors and things that can change. Researchers come and go, instruments play up. We were joking the other day that we really think that there's some, particularly in G52 in our upstairs lab, they talk to each other. If one goes out, the other one's like, I need a break too. It's true. But how could we actually standardise and get a really good idea of one researcher's variability compared to the other researcher's variability within the same researcher and a specific instrument, and then also what is happening within that instrument? Is there a sense of drift? And so sincere thanks to Dr. Eric Munro, who worked with us on this, so that we took the same control books, a selection of those. The researchers did not know what book they were going to get. They were given a sample from that control book. We'd already tested it, and then every month we did a retest to make sure that we weren't seeing a shift over time of the data that we were working with. So that gave us a lot of comfort with the consistency of the data, and that over time we were still producing good data that was not moving in a direction that we did not want. So there's a lot of data, and I've gone through it fairly quickly, but we've got the visual assessment, the condition of the text block. I just want to note there that while we have a lot of other, we've really focused on the condition of the text block, the paper itself, the physical, structural, visual, and events components. Images, we went with, the Library of Congress uses IIIF, the International Image Interoperability Frameworks. We wanted to capture data in a way that could then be shared and would have sustainability for the long term. And the physical testing, as you just heard, pH, tensile, size exclusion chromatography, infrared, reflectance spectroscopy, colorimetry. These are all of the different types of tests, and as I'd said, some of these have 3 or 4 parameters on all of them. So, having now set the scene, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Dr. Andrew Forsberg, who is going to talk through some of those workflow challenges and also the amazing work that he did in developing the platform for capturing that data as well. So, and thank you. And just to let you know, depending on time, we may take some questions at the end of Andrew's session, but the results and outcomes will be this afternoon. So, Andrew, thank you.
Can see terrible things happening if I try to bring that up here. And now I play this game and work out. Okay. Great. Hi, as Val said, I'm Andrew. I worked with Robin and Andrew Davis and all the, you've got a list of all the people. I want us to move on. The workflow, a few times now, in fact, I think every single speaker so far has mentioned the need to be adaptable, responding to things preferably in a timely manner and for improved efficiency. Within the Library of Congress here, physically, we had a number of external factors that we could not have ever anticipated, such as events across the road. COVID was fun. National Guard taking over and all sorts of logistical issues in terms of how do we actually get books in or out, or if I touch this, how long do I have to wait before someone else can touch it? And trying to work out efficient ways to batch and work, and so that was fun, and it continued for a long time, and I don't think we ever really stopped refining that. On the other hand, we also, as Fenella mentioned, and the UK study that Ian also brought up, it's all very well jiggling things around, but you need to ensure consistency over time. Like without that, it's kind of just messing around, really, isn't it? So a lot of thought had to go into this, but roughly it falls into this sort of sequence of events. We had to acknowledge receipt with our partners, and that was often involved because we're dealing with organic material and people, and things go wayward, and email is email, and so on. Then we had the wonderful Kelly doing all the verification of the bibliographic details, which Ian has spoken to, and entering all that data. The visual assessments for the vast majority of the project I took over, and there was a review, often at the stage of the cataloguing, not because of anything that was necessarily wrong, but because we started to find odd things. Ian has spoken to the very small error rate, and in terms of the bibliographic details and cataloging information. And in fact, in terms of most researchers, I would say even academic ones, as long as it's the first edition, it's the first edition. No one really is too fussed. They are concerned with the content of the book. Where things get fuzzy is that from a scientific perspective, if that first edition exists in with 2, 3, 4, 5 different types of paper that degrade at different rates, and you can see the degradation. There's a photo documentation there, as well as the scientific documentation as evidence. Then this, or at least rates of this, should be included as some kind of error margin, I believe, when you're making mass decisions. So there were some fine details added about cataloging. The visual assessment I'll get to in a minute in more detail with the actual photos. Non-invasive. At this stage, I was also doing these and using it to back up what I could see in the visual assessment. So if I suspected we had 2 or more paper types in a single volume. Then I would consider taking multiple samples, because we are now not dealing with one single thing. We are now dealing with a complex, words this morning, I am sorry, collation of different materials together. Just to underline that when we started seeing this, one of the fascinating things, for me at least, and for some of my colleagues, was this was not damage that had happened in different environments. These pages had always existed together. It's not like a mishmash of different books that someone decided as an art project to stick together and, well, surprise, they're behaving differently. For the original market, these paper pages in the paper in these pages was indistinguishable enough that someone thought it was a single book. It was sold as a book. The market treated it as one. And yet we have, so that points, I'm getting to my point, sorry, to Fenella's early point with her slides, that for us, it is the inherent characteristics of the paper that is dictating to a great extent how fast it's going to degrade. Same environment, markedly different rates. So at this stage, we then have 1 or more samples, we have photo documentation, we had a number of people, but the wonderful Amanda Carter took over the lion's share of that. Bless her. That was a project in itself, including documenting multiple samples or any special marginalia, extensive annotations by some owners, like this is a special book because Colonel such and such had a lot to say about the volunteer soldiers of America, and other books. And all of this happens before we even take a physical sample from these books, because we need to establish how many we're going to be dealing with, and then it gets handed over to another world, which I didn't have to deal with. And then from there it went to another world that I did not have to deal with, the return of these books and all those logistics. Here's an example of some of the earliest books where we had this. I mean, I don't think there's any denying that these things are not the same. This is a sample page from, do I need my glasses? No, I don't. From our catalogue, where we could see where things were in terms of had they been catalogued, visually assessed, do the records match against what we were expecting, and access to comparison tools between different books or a report for those books. So every book gets an ID, which is distinct from the samples because we may have more than one. And they're all matched up against a given catalogue record, which came from a grandchild of Ian's spreadsheet. That also matched against institutions and yada, yada, yada. As an inset with some more of the cataloging details that were collected, including physical dimensions, number of pages, which became a bit more important when we're dealing with, an example of standard photo documentation, so cover, spine, front page, verso of the title page is the little thumbnails across the top there, which when you click would appear in the main screen. It's IIIF format so that you have deep zoom available. And we had I'm sure it's coming up, a 2-up slide, so you could do quick comparisons between either pages of one book or one book against another. And some basic descriptive information. Again, the visual assessment as we have it here was specific to the needs for this project. It's not necessarily like something that we're proposing as the standard. And I think this is important for various institutions as well, that they come and develop what responds to the needs of not necessarily even the entire institution, but perhaps a collection or sub-collection as well. But for condition, we divided it up into 4 categories. I think this goes and does something like that. Yes, it does. Physical damage that reflects issues within the inherent properties of the paper that we have. Structural that may be more to do with the printer or binding process. Visual damage, which may or may not reflect anything significant in terms of how good the paper is, and event traces such as the falling and student drops it in the bath, that kind of carry on. One thing I will say about this at this stage is that when assessing these, if I was clicking foxing, it's not, I found a foxing mark somewhere in this book. It was more, I feel like this book is a good representation of a book with foxing, if that makes sense. But similarly, you've got one broken corner. Is this a book that represents broken corners? But no. That's an eager student or an accident. So to try to collect that kind of data against rigorous scientific data and adhere to, properly represent scientific methods and procedures where you may need to do replicates, there may be comments, something might need to be flagged, yada, yada, yada. There are complex programming issues and data storage issues that are involved. And further to that, one of the things that we collectively, it's not me, wanted was, and expected was that since we don't know what we do not know at this stage, and we are going into this project, obviously not trying to bias the results from the beginning, outset, we wanted to store everything as close to how it was represented coming from the machines, the instruments, as possible. So I used CouchDB database as the underlying store for the scientific and the more humanities cataloging librarianship data, because you can literally store documents. You can, and with minimal processing, all of the data that is collected from these instruments, verified of course, just throwing in willy-nilly whatever, gets stored in a way that is then transformed. So we want to try out a new method. I will show you a few things in a minute, or a different approach of processing this or that collection of data. You don't have to try to undo anything. You still have your original material that you set through a series of transformations again. And we were able to get this all working online in real time, pulled from the original data structures. Since we're using PowerPoint like it's 1995, I can't show you how that works. But we have some screenshots that we'll have to do. And you can imagine them moving or something, I don't know. Here's an example of one of the photo documentation, like why it was just super, I love this book, actually. That is toxic. Don't want to go anywhere near that. But this was the only copy of this book that had this like striking color representation on the screen. Is pretty good, not great, but we've got our color checker here, so you can, get it represented accurately. But that greeny yellow that never is a great sign. And here are a couple of copies of the same side by side, and you probably can't see it here, but there are the thumbnails at the top, so you can go and switch and swatch, and there are little drop-down menus over here, so you can fiddle with whether the one on the right represents this and the one on the left has that, and zoom and compare. But more examples of being able to compare and contrast different books. It's in this case for the Abraham Lincoln Prairie Years book. There were different editions. There were just it's not necessarily a cataloging error. From a human perspective, if you request a book and you get this, then that's kind of what we were looking at here, and wanted to be able to test the papers again. If you're testing from the exact same page but they're different paper types, then you know again, shocker, they're going to have very different measurements. More comparisons of how that ended up. And the subjective testing, in this case, this is actually back to our Wife of the First Consul book that we had up before. And you can't see it in this image, unfortunately. But we could pull up arbitrary books or books from the different institutions for a given catalog ID, in this case, Wife of the First Consul. And then there were color coding, sort of like a diff, where if they're all yeses, then they're all a uniform color. If some are no, then they're highlighted in a different color. And then we've got the notes down the bottom here about the binding, I believe. I'm sorry, I can't quite see. Right, yeah, no, we've got the no obvious edge decoration, the yellow-green one, the other types of binding down there. And this is, we did not do XRF for everything, but again, this is about responding to things and timely and where appropriate. We did have an intern do a first few batches. But yes, you can see that one of these is not like the other and has these distinctive peaks for the yellow edge decoration. And again, you can zoom or whatever. And there's a table breakdown. The FORS and the FTIR that Fenella mentioned. So on the right, we have a number of books. No, I'm sorry. We have one book with multiple papers in it. And this one, if I remember correctly, Yeah. The publication stretched over about 10 years, and for most of them, there are multiple paper types. They varied from sort of light cream to salmon pink, and various other colors, gray, blue-gray, and between. Whether there was any, this was all courtesy of one library that sent us all the volumes, even though we asked to only receive one. That was another great thing in this project, was getting 40 books instead of one book. But I mean, even not being able to read this IR spectra, infrared spectra on the right here, and how the responses, what they might mean. You can see these are not the same. And if you make your decisions based on one of them, and you've got a different one, then you maybe should have some error margins and not quite expect them to behave the same. On the left, fours, so the UV and visible light range. Again, for a number of pages from the same book, I believe. Yep. We added some other features, being able to normalize the plots, first and second derivatives, some noise cancelling, and so on. Because we're capturing with the fours, so the UV visible, we're capturing visible, we can also do some fun things with colorimetry and not rely on what Andrew thinks is cream, and instead get something a little bit more scientific and comparable. And Fenella had me go out and try and make these tongue diagrams, I call them. I think Andrew was at the rainbow shark, the shark fin or something. Yeah, they're known by all sorts of. And there are a number of different models, so you can flick in between them. But the point here is that within this space, you can select the books or the pages, because we're talking about samples rather than necessarily whole books, and see just how far they vary, since they're highlighted in the little circle there. And on the right-hand side, we have the raw data, which is considerably more difficult to interpret. For ready reference, there are also some swatches that get generated so that you've got to take into account your monitor may not be accurate, but you can at least see, is this a visible difference or not? Again, we had to expand things along the way to respond to different needs. I'll show how we for time. Too bad. And show you a few of them. So with the query tool, what we wanted to be able to do was take everything, all the things, and put them into your browser, and then choose 1, 2, 3 arbitrary types of measurement. In this case, pH, alkaline acidity spectrum, and tensile, the maximum energy absorption. So this is a composite measurement, but it represents something close to what you'd call strength. All right. And you can see as your pH gets higher, it's more alkaline, with 7 there being neutral. The tensile strength is greater. I mean, I think we know this. There are some outliers. This is useful. Added the ability to plot regressions as well. That is not always useful, but at least it's a math that you don't have to do yourself immediately, and you can see what it might look like. Any one of those dots you can hover over and you can see what it is. In this case, okay, so we've got this weird one out there. Why is that there? In this case, it's because it was published in 1968. It wasn't from the original, it wasn't first edition. That one's fine. We don't need to take it into account. This was a fun thing that we found early on. So we take that one of those tensile measurements, stress here, and we take, as Fenella was saying, we had 5 little squares pulled one way, and then 5 little squares pull until they broke the other way. And it's pretty much a coin toss as to whether any given page, for a book, nope, let's try again, Andrew, for a gathering, whether it is strongest in a vertical direction or in a horizontal one. And this did not sit with what we had been told, what we just assumed was standard practice with printing, with machine direction and how books were bound. Lots of conjecture and various rabbit holes that we all went down after that to try and find out historical reasons why. Is it because of the format? Like maybe, I will speak, you don't want to hear me go on all day, although I could. Here we have the double fold and against energy absorption again, so that sort of strength-ish one. And the double fold here, as tested, I'd fold it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. If it gets to 10, then I leave it alone because, yep, I have a life. I swear I do, outside of this project. The point here that I think is important is that if you have a double fold of, if you take the lowest possible energy absorption measurements that we have across this project, your double fold for that piece of paper could have been 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10. That there's no obvious trend, but there's also at the weekend, you could fold it 10 times. It also could be exceedingly weak paper by objective scientific measurements. And some fun explorations that came up along the way, working with Andrew Davis and all of his lovely, in this case, principal component analysis work. Take all of the things that we get and stick them in a browser again, this time after processing by Andrew. We wanted to check out a few things like and he will talk to this further, but just briefly what this is doing here or why we did it. If you take all those, let's call them dimensions, different measurements, and then you reduce them mathematically, in this case, to 3 significant groups. what does that look like in 3D space? And it was useful to be able to see where the outliers were, maybe also how, because there are little sort of arrows, vectors, for the different measurements where they would pull in this 3D space. And again, this is 1995, so we can't do it, but this is rotatable, and you can zoom in or zoom out, or try to get some sort of mental idea of how these different variables are relating, rather than just looking at the numbers on paper. While he was doing that, I went off along some other little rabbit hole journeys, and wondered whether or not we could, what kind of things we could do in terms of more recent algorithms. This one also rotates and is zoomable, but I was wanting to see how our data, in this case, looking at the infrared data, would group. We were looking at the time at different paper types and whether in fact there were algorithms that could help us identify rag and wood pulp and whatnot. And again, Andrew will go into more detail with that. But in this specific instance, what I was interested in was which windows matter. Like if we cut out, I'm just going to gesture, say this is your spectrum, and we chop off this bit and we chop off that bit, and also we don't care about that bit and that bit. How does that affect these groupings? Can we start to get something that actually reflects what we want or expect to see if we have known things that are RAG or composite? What order does it matter? Does it matter which order these things happen in? So, yeah. And then that got mind-boggling, and I had other work to do, so I left it to Andrew. Yeah, again, I think we have all heard through the news about bias from relying on artificial intelligence, and seen some examples of that and the iterations of even again, I think we made the right call to store things raw and transform later rather than expecting to, again. And I think we have spoken to that. I think the other thing to underline here, which I know I heard Jake talk to and Fenella brief as well, is that when you're storing whole documents of close to raw data, and you decide at a later stage that actually what was really important was, and that was like with the fiddling with UMAP before too, which couldn't have been done if I'd cut out what we'd called noise beforehand. If these projects, or something like this, or these models end up being useful or part of projects that address different materials in a different age. One of Andrew's examples often is the 90s photocopied zines, or 80s ones even, from, I don't know, punk collectives in New York, or more radical dissident publications where money is not something you have and you use whatever you've got. Different variables are going to matter, but you can still throw the document in there clean, but hot, entire, and transform it and then retransform it, or go back to your drawing board. You've lost nothing. You don't have to imagine what it might have been. You actually have that original data still there, and you can test out two different methods, compare them, make sure what you're doing is sane. Speaking of reference papers, so Fenella spoke to the control process. That was obviously critical. But having reference papers to actually work with and make those comparisons. So I don't think they were highlighted in the FORS and IR images I showed before. But we had 10 reference papers that the wonderful Amanda Sartorius selected for us, representing different types of paper that could degrade at different rates. A range of ISR papers, newspaper, cotton rag, wood pulp, from the Charm collection, which I'll probably talk to you better than I can. And you can pull up whichever of those you're interested in and see how they compare with the sample that you have. And the same applies to other things like the SEC, pH, and tensile measurements. And these have all been stored under known conditions within PITD here at the Library of Congress. So, once again, expecting significant changes in circumstances. I have not even touched on the rabbit holes that we have gone down. This has just been real, and tremendous willpower to pull oneself out and go on, because it's not quite like drowning puppies, but it's like waving goodbye to them. There's some, and yeah, the condition of these collection materials, it's the information that we've been gathering, I think in concert with the More Humanities Library leaning and visual assessment information, I think they do need to be taken together, and some thinking needs to be done about this, especially within individual institutions, because their goals and needs are not necessarily reflected by a single number or an average or a statistical trend across 100 years, 100 plus years for circulation books, general circulation books. I mean, your special collections will have different needs, and I'm kind of preaching to the choir, but what I'm also doing is underlining that we are aware of that, that we're not proposing these as answering all of those questions immediately, and in fact they shouldn't. I think a lot more research with those collections would be ideal. And yet Andrew Davis this afternoon will talk to models that I think could be developed, or we believe could be developed, to help assist those from the circulation materials. Like, I don't know, like the condition of one Shakespeare lexicon from 1883, or even all of them. I mean, I'm a medievalist by academic training, and what people thought about Shakespeare in 1880, whatever. Okay, right. You know, that may be of great interest for a historian, and they may be doing some comparative work, and yeah, that's kind of interesting work too. But do we need a colossal number of redundant copies of this particular lexicon? I do not think we do. Individual copies, like that colonel with his soldier stories, amazing. But the point I want to make is that if work on the Shakespeare lexicons, right, whatever, can assist us making decent decisions about materials where there may only be one or two or three copies in existence worldwide, they truly are unique and always have been unique, then huzzah, and we have done something truly useful or contributed towards it, I guess. And I think that is me. Oh, look, we've got called to lunch. All right. Thank you very much.
We've got a little bit of time, so I'd like to open to questions for the morning session, anything for Jake or Ian or Andrew or myself, and I will repeat the question for any of our remote viewers. So do we have any questions from the audience? It's kind of fascinating going back and remembering some of the fun moments that we went through. So, Lynn.
I have a quick question about the FORS data. You said you only used the UV invisible portion of the spectra?
So the question was some of the data, which we'll talk about this afternoon. So essentially, the question was, are we just using specific sections? Some of the modelling, and please feel free to jump in, was seeing if certain components of the spectrum were more useful and if we just took that rather than all of it. But what Andrew was saying was we collected all of it, and part of the modelling was to see were certain components potentially useful so we wouldn't have to long-term take all of it. But we captured all of the data from the whole spectrum. And
did you not use the...
That will be answered in this afternoon, yes.
Just to clarify, was the full UV-vis near infrared, the entire spectrum were collected? That's a lot of words to throw at people who don't necessarily...
So Andrew's just confirming that we collected all the near-IR UV-vis. The whole spectrum was collected, but part of the questioning was, as we do this modelling, can we get away without having to capture all of this? We do this in some other techniques where we're imaging in different wavebands. Do we need every waveband, or is it just showing up in the IR, for example? So thank you, great question. Any? Patty?
So I have a question about sizing. I've not heard sizing at all in any of the things you're talking about. And are you looking at, the other things besides cellulose, right? Sizing or inks or whatever's in the paper?
Patty was asking about sizing and what other things we're looking at in the paper. So yes, we'll talk about that this afternoon. One of the challenges has been, how much of that can be captured consistently with the, just for those online, Patty smiled, how we can capture that consistently with an objective test method, or if it's on a different colour paper and the interpretation of the spot is an issue. We did have one of our wonderful Haku students go through and do that, and the variability in the interpretation of some of those comments, but we were really hoping that some of those tests would pull out a little bit more. We will teaser for this afternoon. We did have one that actually is a nice example, and for those of our remote audience, sizing is essentially the process of the paper where it's processed to engage better with ink when you write on the paper. So we have a question from a remote audience from down the back.
So what application is used for the database? What application is used for the database?
What application was used to build the database? Do you want to?
I built it.
Yeah, well, I mean, Andrew built it. I mean, we talked about CouchDB and Apache and some of the other components. Is that what they're wanting? But essentially, it was. I'll talk a little to this in the afternoon, but it was not. There was nothing out there that would do what we wanted. As you've seen, we're taking multiple instruments, and the first part was working with manufacturers for many years to be able to extract from an instrument where they're like, no, we won't give it to you as this. It's like you can have it in this format. So we had to work through, and Andrew worked through, stepping away from proprietary formats to be able to extract it in a way, as he noted, that we can reinterrogate constantly. If we suddenly come up, we started chronologically with the books that went a little out the window as the pandemic occurred, but each time we moved to a new time period, a little bit of different information would pop up, and we're like, oh, we need to go back and say, is the sizing, is this, what are we seeing in this time period that we didn't see in the previous one? So having that raw data to better reinterrogate with new questions was a huge component of that. So hopefully that sort of answered the question. Is there another one down there? Lisa.
So one question that always comes to mind for me is, what kind of plans do you have in place for actually preserving all the data, which seems to me is just a tremendous amount.
The question was, how are we going to preserve the data? So we're working with the digital strategies at the Library of Congress, where we can actually keep the entire data set with a permanent identifier. So that will be available, and because that is one of the requirements of the grant. With some of the other platforms that we built, which some of you have played with a little bit, we're hoping to also work with our colleagues to better have that as a long-term resource for people to better work with some of those tools and look at the pH and go, wait, if I just take this decade for my collection, what does this look like? So that's the intent, and that will be shared and made available. But there will be a data set with a permanent identifier that will assure that there is long-term access to all of this data.
That will be managed by the library.
Correct. That will be managed and supported by the library. Trey.
What you're speaking to is, I think, aligns well with research data, like the principles of FAIR, findable, accessible, interoperable, retrievable data sets. Because the tools and methods change over time, how we look at something now could drastically change in 5 years.
Yeah, so Trey Burney from Canal was a wonderful comment about the FAIR data principles, which if you're not aware, well, I'll touch on this afternoon, add in some key ones as well. And that really when we're thinking about research data, the question at the time can change over time, or an event may occur where we suddenly need to look at a specific time period. So we need to make sure that, and that was a long discussion early on and a big part of really trying to capture the raw data, all of the data, and being able to interrogate different data sets together. Most of the people and or scientists in the room are well aware that usually a scientific data set is mass spectrometry or microscopy or size exclusion chromatography. You can't generally say, is there anything in the mass spec that relates to the tensile strength? It's just not connected. So this was Andrew really did a very good job of downplaying the amazing work he did. It was a phenomenal and groundbreaking way of being able to pull together multiple data types as well as all of the different parameters. So is it this load at break? Is it the stress? Is it the energy of rupture? We've got about 10 parameters, and Andrew Davis will talk to this afternoon. Which one of those is the best in terms of what we're thinking about for how that particular type of test might predict certain things in the future? So, but it's a challenging issue, but it'll be there too. Sorry, just 1 second. Chris?
So if the double fold number doesn't correlate with the tensile strength, what physical property or properties does it correlate with?
I will leave that question. So the question was, and I'm seeing some actions in the audience and some grins. The question was, if double fold doesn't correlate with tensile strength, what property does it correlate with? So I'm going to not answer that question, and I'm going to leave it for Andrew Davis to pick up this afternoon. Teaser, not many. Sorry, Lynn and then Jake.
Oh, yeah, I was interested that you brought up about spot testing and how subjective it is. And I find that a very interesting subject. Is that something you pursued to look at, the subjectivity of spot testing and maybe in concert with tester variability?
So the question was the whole intrigue of spot testing and subjectivity. I will encourage you in the break to take a look at some of the work that's been done. Yes, we did a lot of work with a round robin because particularly one of the things we're looking at, and it came out of some other work we'd already been doing, if you're even just using a pH pen on different coloured papers, what you might interpret is very different to someone else if it's brownish versus white versus cream. We were so hoping that one of the tests would be really easy to translate in terms of that, but we did a lot of that with different users within PRTD, with our partners. They all got sent a set of multiple types of pH pens, multiple types of paper, not a lot of interpretation, and have at it. And so it was really interesting. We were Amanda Sartorius can talk to that. She had the mind-numbing job of trying to collate some of those variations along with instrumental. But that was a big area that we're just touching on. So
Are you going to talk about that?
I'll touch on it a little bit at the end tomorrow. This afternoon. Yeah. Jake.
I don't want to.
Do you want to come up and?
No. I don't want to set expectations too high that Andrew Davis will answer every question that we have. But maybe just to sort of see that discussion. I mean, one of the things that has come out to me throughout this project is that as a preservation administrator, I think of these as the general collection.
So for our remote audience, maybe Jake, would you mind?
Yeah.
So Jake Nadal, our director, is just going to come up and. He was going off screen.
Yeah, but sorry. I guess it's the privilege of my position. I get to ramble on with my questions. I guess I'm curious, maybe while we have a little time, if you could speak to a facet of this project that I'm sure we want to talk about more this afternoon, which is I am accustomed, and preservation librarians are often trained just to think of these as the general collections, right? And I'm seeing so much that uniqueness is ordinary. It's hard to find a through line, and help us get a sense from all the data you've seen, all that you've looked at, the rabbit holes you haven't gone down. How can you help us just sort of start thinking for our discussion this afternoon about how we make that transition from the general to the specific, right? When I need to make a big decision about 1 million items, or I need to assess, how I'm going to take care of this item in hand. Can you do a little myth busting for me, I guess, just about a book is a book is a book across this time period?
So Jake kind of wants us to talk about this afternoon session. Essentially, one of the consistent things about this project was the inconsistency. One of the big myth-busting challenges that we were hit with right from the start was the same is not the same. Multiple paper types, as you've heard already. Even within the first go-round, one of my first stress level quotient rises was the first series of books we got from one of the partners. We opened the boxes and I get this phone call from someone. It's like, there's 3 books missing. I'm like, we only just opened the box. How can we have lost 3 books already? Well, sometimes 3 books are actually bound together into one. So we hadn't actually lost any books, but that was an early one. Within the first 3 shipments of essentially the same books from the partners, we started taking cart images because they were so variable. We had the same 3 books from 3 partners. Two of them had completely different covers. One of them was twice as thick as the other one because it was printed on thick paper. One was twice the size because one was half the size because it had its edge trimmed. And we're like, this is where our little brains and the rabbit holes turned into rabbit warrens. We were like, this is the same book. And, you know, Ian and I and all, we've all had some amazing discussions about when is the same, because cataloguing wise, it is. The content is the same, but the physicality was so different. And I think early on, seeing those multiple paper types, if you think that your volume is the same as someone else's because the content is the same and you've checked everything else, but wait a minute, what if one's rag and one's wood pulp? We are seeing so many of those. If you're making your decision based on the fact that OCLC says there's 12 other copies out there, but you don't actually know what they're made of. And so the physicality of what we were seeing within these collections was really mind-blowing. And I just want to thank the partners for their ability to absorb some of this crazy information as we're like, yeah, and by the way, for example, an early book we got, which should have been, I think it was 1895, we're like, this is weird. Well, it was actually a photocopy, but the catalogue hadn't been upgraded. So, you know, there was some interesting little notes back to partners of like, by the way, did you know this? So is that sort of what you think? Yeah, so I think one of the things, and Ian can talk to this too, and I might hand over for him to come up, is to the model, how do you make that decision about how many copies? And being able to factor into the probability of, okay, now we have 7 paper types, and that means this, then you're starting to think about, and move from, well, how do we make this decision and be very conservative so we keep everything, which is really not an option for a lot of institutions. But how do we make that decision? Did you want to talk a little bit, Ian?
So as you know, the difficult part about this is if libraries are going to be making decisions based on mass data, you know, I have 1 million books that I have to figure out what to do with. If we could make good generalizations, we could use that data. If we can't make good generalizations, we will assume that they're all in the worst case scenario. Because there's no real way in order to take all of the copies, do testing, which many of the libraries don't have labs in order to do that testing of what type of paper is it? Can we figure out what the stress and strain of those papers can take? What do the bindings look like? All of that. We won't be able to do that. So from my perspective, understanding whether or not we can make predictions is important, and if we can't, that's really, really important information for us to know. And it actually feeds back into this decision-making process of we can't assume that they're all the same, we can't assume that they're all different, and we can't necessarily guess where the good quality copies are going to be and where the bad quality copies are going to be. So because of that, we'll probably assume that they're in the worst case scenario if you have to do big, broad decisions based on assumptions. I know that's unsatisfying, but that's just kind of where we're at with it.
And so I don't want to take the highlight from this afternoon, but some of the complexity we're seeing to aid with some of that is which publisher started using wood pulp sooner than others. The time period, what's happening in that time period, where is that paper coming from? And those are some of the nuances that we will start to tease out this afternoon. There are guidelines we can give you about good publishers and maybe ones from certain time periods you might not want to. We won't pick on Boston. Hope there's no one from Boston online. But there is information there, and as you'll see from the complexity, just trying to extract that has been the wonderful challenge and the rabbit warren that we've been going down. But there's some really interesting components there that we can pull out as guidelines, where if you know from the catalogue information, it's from this location and this time period and this publisher, ooh, let's keep 3 or not. You know, so we've got some of that type of matrix or decision-making capacity that we're trying to tease out. Any other questions or comments from Jake?
I have one more, and it's not about this afternoon. We're accustomed to thinking of scientific equipment in labs as very expensive, simpler equipment. By the end of this project, we brought in technicians rather than PhD scientists to do the work. Is that gap closing between what the Library of Congress does and what another institution can do?
So Jake Nadal, Director of Preservation, was just asking about moving from a very rigid scientific research lab to what tools are available and how much they cost. Apologies to those of you who are online. I'm hoping we can send out some images. But we started with the model of we need PhD researchers to be able to do this. We set up all the controls and procedures for looking at the variability. And we then started to look at portable tools, simple tools, things that Bluetooth to your phone. We really moved from the gamut from the desktop to what is the portable. And part of that is we want to use that data in a thoughtful way, and we had 2 PhDs as the start, and we have 2 wonderful recent graduates at the moment. There is no difference between their capacity to do the test methods, and their thought processes are stellar and wonderful to have new thoughts and concepts coming in. But we had put all those processes in place, looking at the instrumental error, looking at what's happening. So we had huge confidence in the capacity for just about anyone to come in and go, well, I like this IR. I mean, I know it's yours, Amanda, but yes, and I can take the spectra and look, we've got this way of interpreting and the modelling you'll see this afternoon. Oh, this is how we can start to take this huge data set and make some sense out of it. So we're really trying to make the science accessible, and you'll also see some other interesting things that have impacted that as well. So we are going to take a break now. We figured 2 hours was long enough for us to talk at you and with you. So we're going to take a break from 12 till 2. I hope many of you will join us to the right of the room. To my left, you'll talk to some of our amazing staff and some of the work and some examples of like hands-on different paper types. What does this feel like? What does this mean in terms of the small tools, and to Lynn's question about spot tests and colours. So that will be there, and we will put up a timer, I believe, for those of you online. Apparently you will have to time yourself. So if you could please come back at 2. And if anyone has questions that they didn't want to ask out loud, but the good thing is I think everyone feels very comfortable. Anyone online, please feel free to drop any questions into the chat or write them down on the little cards that were on some of the pieces of paper, and we will bring those together for after the results and outcomes session with our panel, Q&A panel with scientists, staff and partners. So thank you again. Thanks to all my co-presenters, and we look forward to seeing you at 2 o'clock. Welcome back, everyone, for our afternoon. It's great to see you all again, and now we're going to share all of those teasers we were dropping out in the morning. So just a tiny bit of a recap for folks who may have just joined us online, where this is a program where we're taking 500 of the same books from 5 different research libraries and trying to figure out if the same is the same or not. So this morning we talked about a lot of the background for the decision making of where we got to and what does that mean from here. One of the things that there was quite a lot of discussion during the break and some of the questions were the fact that we really need to be able to actively interrogate the data, and it therefore needs to be in a format that we can access. And if we've got data sets and we need to be able to compare it with different types of instrumentation, if it's not together in the same platform, that becomes a tiny bit challenging. Then you end up doing 1,272 spreadsheets, which could be fun, but then you hit that limit, right, with the spreadsheet, and you're like, why did they just give me, well, Andrew's going to give us the number of however many test data points we have. And so as we started to think about this, well, not as we started, one of the things I've found over the years is that a lot of people get to the end of a project and they're like, we want to be fair data, findable, accessible, reusable. And then they go, oh, we probably should have not collected things as JPEGs and proprietary file formats. So this was a big discussion, which was probably a bit boring for us all at the beginning, but the FAIR data, the LOUD data, linked open usable, we worked a lot with some colleagues from the Getty, and then CARE data principles, which is really where we're starting to think more about how we're linking with Indigenous knowledge and collections. And that's something we really wanted to make sure going forward in terms of sustainability. And for those of you who aren't aware, I encourage you to look to the CARE data principles for Indigenous data governance and for any other collections. And there's a lot of work with GEDA to compare both FAIR and CARE data. So just a tiny recap, we were thinking about, well, in terms of the access and reusing the data, we needed to be able to have this infrastructure where we could reinterrogate. As you're starting to hear, each time another decade came along, we'd see something slightly different. So if we had had to rebuild the data set from the start, we could not have done that. We'd spent most of our time driving people nuts and reconnecting, remaking the wheel. So that flexibility that we needed was really important to be able to suddenly adapt to the changing things we were seeing, and also how could we encompass expanding data sets that we were, suddenly we do XRF and or. So this all continued to expand and adapt. You keep hearing that word, adaptability is the new normal. So multivariate data, I think you're just starting to get a feel for the fact that there's not one data point or even 5 data points for each book. There's multiple paper types, so we have them all for each paper type and or the visual assessment, as well as all of the different data points. So what does that mean? Any individual measurement is going to be connected with multiple points and functions of multiple variables. So for example here, if we are breaking the paper, we're ripping it, and then we get the spectra, that's all very interesting, but how do we actually interpret that? And this is where, because we've captured this really powerful set of data, now we can start to look at what's going on and think about what does this mean for collections where they don't have the instruments, but we can start to use this data set as training and thinking about what a model might be going forward from that. Just what you've been waiting for. What does the National Collection look like? I mean, really? Well, a little bit of a surprise. We sort of started to hear it this morning. Within the same set of books, we're seeing multiple types of paper. I think you've already figured that one out. The paper types are not the same across all of the same volumes, so huge thanks to Megan and Elizabeth for putting this image together. At the lower level, and we think it's higher, but at the lower level, at least 15% of the volumes have multiple paper types within them. When we took multiple test papers, we only did that if the block was more than 25%. So you've seen some images from Andrew this morning where there was 5 or 6 different gatherings with different types of paper. We did need to come to an end with this project. We did not take samples of every different paper type, only if it was more than 25% of the text block. So you're starting to see, we're just looking at the main paper type and the impact on the collection. And some of the test property data that we're starting to see is it's not just a colour shift, those papers actually have different properties. So we see multiple paper types and condition in one volume. I'm not quite sure what's happening at the bottom there, but we'll move on from there. And then again, here we have examples of gatherings with different types of paper deterioration, suggesting that there were different paper stocks used. And I'm going to repeat a little bit of this, but you're starting to get the feel for these are not the same. It might be the same content, but physically these volumes are not the same. So these are 2 volumes, two gatherings in the same volume that have actually responded in very different ways because of the paper composition. So the variation versus consistency, as I said at the end this morning, that the only thing that was consistent was the inconsistency that we were finding. While we expected there to be some variation, it was a lot more than we expected. So, for example, it's known, and I'll see nods, I'm sure, from the librarians and folks in the room, that publishers would offer the same title at different price levels and components. And here's just one example of different covers, but in fact, the title, where the title pages are identical, but there's different types and grades of paper within. So we're starting to see some other factors than just the paper itself coming into this. Does location matter? Dr. Andrew Davis also has some great graphs here, but here's stress over time from 1840 to 1930 here. Now, as I click through the partners, you're going to see that that spread is essentially the same across. We are not seeing, there's a tiny variation. There is no significant difference between each of the partners. We kind of had this idea that maybe this magical place in America would be the place that all the books were perfect. It might still exist, but that's for the next project. Capitol Hill. Well, my director just informed me that we're there. We're right here. We can stop right now. So this is where I think it gets really interesting. We start with a scientific project, and huge thanks to the Mellon Foundation for going, yes, let's look at the science side. But it all ties back to that societal and economic data. I kind of find it amusing that we're like, why are the papers types? And then Amanda Sartorius did a wonderful story map of all of the the paper production changes over time. But we end up verifying what we're seeing in the science by going back to the societal and economic. And this is my other huge bugbear or desire for the world change that people who know me know, which is we cannot segregate these data types. We have got to be and connect the economic and the societal data with the science. It just informs each other. I mean, this is what I think makes it so important. So this was another one of those lovely rabbit holes that sort of became a bit of a warren. And what was the historical review of what was going on at the time? Now, if you think back to when I talked about the random stratified sample, we also were thinking per decade, but they didn't kind of just decide at 1901 that they would do X or the war would happen at 1915. I mean, sometimes we have to start to think what's happening within that decade as well. So we've got the change in paper manufacture. We're seeing World War I, the economic downturn, increased production, and different specific literary categories. Sometimes a book would be printed and then it became popular. It might actually either go into a paperback and be mass-produced and be poorer quality, or if it suddenly became more important, they might start making it on good quality paper. So we're seeing these very interesting shifts and changes as we go through. So a shout out to Amanda for the 19th century paper production, but we wanted to sort of pull in not just that mechanical and shift in what's happening, but what's happening too. There's World War II, there's Gettysburg, there's all of these things that are impacting what we're physically seeing in the materiality of these books that are not the same. So probably more words than you can read right there. So just some visual examples that I think really start to strike home what we're looking at. So here's the same catalogue ID, and again, huge thanks to Amanda here and Megan and Elizabeth for some images coming up. So, we're looking at that in different locations, okay? Now, to Jake's point, we also, at the instigation of my wonderful director, pulled the same 500 books from the Library of Congress. We have not been able to analyse those yet, so I'm thinking, guys, job security. But one interesting thing about that is, being in the Copyright Office, that collection came into this location, and it's always been in one of our buildings. So we have another set that we can compare with that potentially might add some of that additional data. We just have not had time yet to look at those additional 500. Here you're seeing localized foxing. What's interesting, you're seeing text block at the back. What we do find, particularly if there's glossy pages, that there's this microclimate, and we're seeing a lot more foxing on the paper block and at that interjunction with glossy papers, which was not something you might think about. You know, I think once someone says, you're like, oh, well, that makes sense. But these are some of those nuances that we're just starting to pull out and think about. So foxing by location, these are all rag paper. So you're not seeing an awful lot there, but the average, the pH is 5.4 to 6.4. So while we're seeing differences in some of the visual components, we're not seeing it in the test parameters. Here's one by location, which is more prominent in the more humid environments. Now we're seeing the wood pulp. This is a slightly acid to neutral range, what you're seeing there. Then if we compare wood pulp again in a different pH range, what are we starting to see? So the beauty of some of this is that we have lots of visual images of every book, because we took as many images as we could. We knew we only had the time that the book was with us. It went back to the partners, but we had this snapshot in time that we can now, as Andrew was saying this morning, we can now take those visual images of different components, of different types of damage, and start to compare them as well. So multiple copies at one location, we can start to see that variance that relates a little bit more to the usage component. So here we're seeing one book that has been heavily taped and cornered, and that was the one who seemed to be being used more. And now we're starting to see the difference in some of the physical properties in terms of the paper itself that ties us back to that usage component. And this again is, as I was saying earlier, is it going to sit on a professor's shelf, or is it going to be thumbed a lot by a very anxious and eager student? And some of the same volumes. So what we have is we were starting to look at why things were different. Megan and Elizabeth did a sort of a deep dive into some of this. So the top three rag paper, the bottom wood pulp. So it was originally printed in 1911. The two reprints are from 14 and 18. So we're going into the war period. Now we're seeing that they're moving to wood pulp. So we're starting to see the impact of what's happening societally and in terms of production because of these changes that are occurring. The same volumes, we have one that was different, that was with the main ones are on glossy. There's one there that's on wood pulp that was actually subcontracted to another publisher. I will reach out and check with General Counsel, because as the Library of Congress we cannot endorse certain publishers and or manufacturers, so I probably might have to be a little bit careful about what we say about certain publishers through time and what we think about that, but I'm sure we can get that information. And then just my last example here is, again, as I said, we've got all of these images that we've taken, and with a very careful eye, Elizabeth and Megan realised there was this tiny wee number that was right next to the mark. And that links back, in fact, to a particular printer's house in Chicago. Now, this is another rabbit hole that I so want to go down, and I haven't quite got there yet. But there was a paper mafia, right? There was. So some of these were known to be using less quality paper. So I hope you're starting to get a feel for the complexity, but how much we can actually pull out of these images and the projects that will probably keep giving for a long period of time. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Andrew Davis, who will start to do that deep dive into the modelling. And as I'm giving you individual examples, but how do we start to really think about the different components and bring those together? Thank you, Andrew.
Let's make sure I know how to got this working. All right, great. So I hope you've enjoyed all the pretty pictures, because I've got none. So I hope that you've found some caffeine during lunch, something to keep you awake during lots and lots of plots. I love them. I'll try to convey that enthusiasm and keep them approachable. I know people have also mentioned, this is where all the answers come in, and you're not going to get them. Hopefully I'll give you more questions, though, and we can talk about some more good questions. So a little bit about me, just real quick. So I'm Andrew Davis. I'm a chemist in PRTD. I've really only been working around the edges of this project, doing some of the more esoteric analyses on the data sets, also running some of the support for various pieces of fairly complicated equipment in our lab when they decide to misbehave. I know we're going to have a list of everyone who's been involved in this project towards the end, but Andrew Forsberg gave a really great walkthrough of the workflow and just how involved that was, and then kind of said, and then I went up to the lab and we took all the tests, and that was a lot of work. A lot of work. And there were some people who spent their entire hours that they were here in our building doing that work. Andrew did it, Dr. Robin Hodgkins, who was here, did it. Megan and Elizabeth were, just perched at the machines all the time getting data. I want to thank the advisory group, the technical advisory group, who kind of walked us through some of these analyses that I'm going to show you today, and also the PRTD staff in general, who've just been awesome in supporting this. It's not nothing. And so to give you a quick sense of where this study compares to similar studies that have been done, there have been a few, there haven't been many, but there have been some that have taken lots of scientific measurements over hundreds of books spanning hundreds of years. And we've done a lot, especially compared to those. And so William Barrow's group did a study kind of similar in scope to ours. Matthias Strelick's group has done one as well that also kind of spans the same time period that we've been studying here. And I just wanted to give you a sense of what our work here compares to in terms of those really big studies. This is that same plot as before, but just subdivided by decade and how many books were measured during that period of time. And so just kind of in a best case scenario, 5 partners, 5 matching copies, or 5 matching copies each from the partners of 500 titles, that's 2,500 books. You can start doing the math of all the different measurements we took. It adds up to about 50,000 unique measurements, simple quantitative measurements on each book. But those are replicates that are averaged over replicates of, each instrument. That gets to 250,000 measurements. That's best case scenario, assuming you don't have to do control books and redos and new books and things. And maybe that's if you only have one paper type in each way. It's a lot of measurements, right? And that's what we're measuring. These are these quantitative values. This is not even including, I'm not even talking about the spectra, the visual assessments, the spot tests. It's not quite what people mean when they mean big data, but for us and for cultural heritage, that's pretty big. And it spans things that are easily approachable, like age or colorimetry data, an LAB color space, kind of like RGB color space, if you're familiar with that, just a different color space. Double fold, numbers that are maybe approachable to non-science labs, but then you get into the things that are unique to this project, laboratory measurements like pH, like the molecular weight of the cellulose using size exclusion chromatography. If you're familiar with the literature, you might hear that called degree of polymerization. If that's a phrase that's familiar to you, just know that they're completely and directly convertible between molecular weight and degree of polymerization. And then these strength properties that are all dependent on each other in some way. It's at least 20 quantitative measurements per book. Some of them are related, some of them are some of the samples are potentially related. They're printed, made at the same time. So first things first, what does that data look like? You've seen plots like these before. This is just one variable, that tensile stress at break over the publication date. And this is the most consistent punchline in our data. Real world data is messy. There's a lot of variation. I think this shows just how much variable those books are during this time period. And we see that across every analysis we've explored. I'm just showing you one now. And so what I've been trying to do is find ways to sift and organize this data, find some of the trends that might exist underneath. One of those ways that's been hinted at so far is to maybe subdivide them by what these books are made of. In this case, subdividing by majority of their pulp composition. And this is a model that I developed kind of early on using our infrared spectroscopy data, where you can take that data and just using that measurement alone, get a pretty good prediction of where that paper falls on a continuum of likely fully rag versus likely fully wood pulp, anywhere in between. They go through a partial least squares regression model that was trained up using our reference collection in Barrow books of known compositions. There was, excuse me, a question before about, could you use sizing? Could you use other material compositions to subdivide these? And this was sort of the low-hanging fruit. It was very easy. It was the most consistently and reliably predicted. So it's the one that we stuck with from the get-go. You can take that data right off the start and say, what are the compositions? How are those compositions over time? That gets to this point that we've talked about on how paper making is changing over time. They start off mostly rag. The black lines are how much rag is in these books, and the lighter lines are how much wood pulp. And then around 1880s, 1890s is when that shift starts occurring. And this is just a 3-year moving average. And so I apologize for the text-heavy slide, but I did say I was going to have a lot of graphs coming up, and so I don't want to bury the lead. I want to get to some of our conclusions first, things that you can kind of keep in mind as I start going through these. And I think these are dividable into 2 main sets, and this is how the rest of my slides are going to go. The first ones are just about these properties themselves, these individual measurements, how they correlate, how they match up to each other. There were no obvious, clear, universal trends. As much as we wanted to find them between different variables, there was just so much variation between them. Maybe the most consistent was that all the books we tested during this time period, not all, there were outliers to everything. The vast majority are acidic. Some properties trended differently, depending on what those things were made of. So you could have rag-based paper that was fairly consistent in its tensile break stress, but that same tensile break stress would change over time if you're talking about the wood pulp papers. The second group of kind of conclusions are how these books match up to each other. We say, okay, these are matched titles, same copy. How do they compare? We found about 1 in 4 of them were made of different things from the start. That's kind of the bolder prediction. We have some error estimates. We can bring that back a little bit. But this is when one partner's copy, the predictions say it was made of primarily rag, or another one's same title was made of primarily wood pulp. So right from the get-go, they're not going to be starting from the same place from the moment they were made. You saw already many of the books had multiple mixed types within a book, mixed pulp types within a book. We checked how much the different properties varied over time, how consistent they were between copies. 1880s is when things start changing, when you can start saying something about how likely your copy is compared to someone else. And I'll get into the details of that in a moment. So with those in mind, let's get into these variables. What do we do with this data, right? How can you make some sense from this? One way you might start is by doing some statistical binning. So this is a box and whisker plot. If you recall back to your kind of school math days, this finds kind of the distribution of data over certain chunks of time. In this case, every 5 years, we're looking about how each property is changing. It helps clean up a lot of the noise. It helps make some of those trends look a little more observable. And those boxes are, where the 25th to 75th percentile of the data. So most of the data from that 5-year period will then fall within that box. Gives us a quick sanity check of how properties from one time period perhaps are changing over another. And if you look at that, you can maybe find some wiggles. You say, oh, maybe the 1910s and 19-teens are a little lower, but what does that mean? Is that meaningful? I don't know about you. I have a very hard time figuring out what 20 megapascals of break strength means. So showing some other books and how they compare might be useful here. So here's that same plot, stress at break, and that's just from books a couple decades after that period that we were studying here. And you can see that even just a few decades later, their strength, or their tensile strength, is double from what we're measuring here, right? So we're really kind of sifting needles in haystacks in this time period from 1840 to 1940. It also really highlights why that period is of interest. Can we say anything about these books? Are we just resigned to say they're kind of on the lower end of even books in decades nearby, or can we figure out any additional information? So here are two properties, one chemical property, acidity on the top, strength on the bottom. This is that stress at break again. And you start thinking, oh, maybe there's some wiggle room here, but it's still hard to say whether there are any trends. One way we might divide them, we say, okay, let's further divide these. Let's further divide these, see if we can uncover trends underneath this data. One of the unique aspects of this project is we have matched copies of each. We say, how are your properties different from the same books at the library next door? And so let's split them out by partner institute. This is pH, median pH, by each of the partners. And I had to revisit this plot multiple times because I thought I was going crazy. This looks wrong. This looks copy-pasted, identical. I promise you it's not. Even the error bars are weirdly similar. We can talk about this some more for anyone who's interested. We can't tell the difference. It's a chemical property. It's the same. The molecular weight, the structure of the cellulose, the degree of inflammation, it's the same. The stress between partners, this is what we wanted. We wanted to find differences. This was the best, easiest answer we were hoping for. We would say, all right, just all the data, just all the ones from Cornell, all the ones from Arizona, compare them to each other. They look the same. We can't distinguish in aggregate one partner from another. So what about composition? What about that composition? Maybe if we split them out by whether they're made of primarily rag or primarily wood pulp. Some properties change, some don't. There's that chemical property on the top, that's acidity. Bottom is one of those strength properties, that's the stress at break. Acidity looks pretty constant. On the left side of both, you have the rag-based papers. On the right, you have mostly wood pulp composition. Acidity is pretty constant. It doesn't really matter when or what it's made of. This period of time, they're all in very similar range. There's a little bit of difference in behavior, perhaps, on what they're made of and how that affects stress at break. On the bottom, the rag-based papers seem pretty consistent over time. There does look to be, a trend, perhaps, in the wood pulp, moving, in different directions at different moments in time. How about variables that affect each other, right? So that's any individual variable over time. How about one that affects the other? This is some expected trends, but still extremely messy, right? This is how acidity, pH on the bottom, affects strength properties on the y-axis. This is, in this case, tensile energy absorption. And you can see that in general, the acidic books, the ones on the left side of the pH scale down there, have less strength properties, and the ones above pH about 8 start to have much higher strength properties. It's also clearly a nonlinear relationship. There's this kind of elbow bend around pH 7 or 8 where suddenly they start to get much stronger. It's not just as pH sort of drifts upwards, the strength drifts upwards. That's not the way this relationship works. But you can also see from this plot that just the vast majority of books in this time period are acidic. You can draw those trends, but there aren't that many to draw those correlations from on the non-acidic end of the scale. You can do a similar sort of thing with a color property, and I'm just showing some examples here. I'm really not trying to show you, trends to take away, other than to just show how difficult this is. This is yellowness. It's a B star value, kind of estimate as a degree of yellowness, and how that correlates with strength. And there's maybe a relationship there, but you can go back and think about Andrew's toxic yellow book, and is that an aging parameter or something that's on the paper? That's what makes this data hard to work with. It's really just a taste of how messy and complex these books and their properties are. So I've showed you a few pairs of relationships now. Just as examples, we have all the iterations of those 20 plus different variables plotted against and combined and correlated to each other. Those on their own are hard to keep in your mind, but that doesn't even assess the question of whether two variables can combine to affect a third in some way. And to do that, you need to start doing some multivariate analysis. Don't worry, I'm not going to get into this plot. Not going to get into the details of principal component analysis and what that means, other than to say that we've started exploring some of these multivariate relationship and analyses that are possible. We've done some regression fitting, and I'll get into a bit more on this plot later, but not really on the details of it. The takeaway, though, is really what a plot like this might let you do is start IDing groupings within your data, areas of these multivariate relationships that you can then use to connect to some actionable criteria, to start untangling these multivariate relationships and say, all of these variables that combine in this way, how do we connect them to something usable like color or visual conditions? And even when you use multivariate relationships, you see that these other properties depend on some of the subgroupings. The relationships in multivariate space will change if you're looking at rag papers or wood pulp papers. So, what do they mean, right? What do these all mean? We really, the scientist in me loves thinking about how these connect to each other, but let's try to tie them to a usability metric of some kind, something you can tangibly appreciate. And so this is molecular weight. That's that degree of polymerization, the integrity of the cellulose structure. It's another one of those properties you can see depends on whether you're talking about rag pulps at different times or wood pulps at different times. You can take some properties, some cutoffs that are of interest to you and start thinking where these fall in those criteria. In this case, there's been some work from Matthias Strelick's group. I'm highlighting here because it is directly computable to the measurements that we're taking, where he took some papers, measured their degree of polymerization and when pages started breaking. When would these values on the y-axis start relating to breakages in the paper? And that's where that line is in relation to the measurements that we're taking. And so you don't need to know what 40 kilodalton molecular weight is to know that, okay, ones above this are starting to be, that are okay, but ones below this cutoff are starting to maybe be fragile and brittle as you're handling them. That gives us another handle to work on for connecting to real world use properties, right? So that's a physical cutoff to say, when does it start breaking? When does the paper start breaking? When does it not start breaking? Another criteria you might use is just a statistical distribution to say, what's typical of this time period, right? Is this book typical for what other books are doing at this time? And you can do these with these box plots. You can say, all right, things that are maybe in those boxes, 50th percentile in either direction, those are typical. Some relationships are obvious, like pH here. What's typical for this time period? Acidic papers are typical, full stop. If you have a non-acidic book in this time period, it's unusual. It's an atypical book, right? That's a pretty easy one to use. It gets a little more complicated with these variables that change over time. You'd have to start defining regions of typicalness to say, all right, is this typical for a rag-based paper in the 1880s? If you look at, say, a break stress, even if you don't know what it means, of 30 megapascals of a wood pulp paper, if it's in 1920, that's unusually strong. If it's in about 1880 or 1890, that's about on par for what those books are looking like. You'd have a different range of definition. I'll come back to this typicality. What's typical for this region of time? Say pH, right, it was acidic. We're finding these acidic books. Maybe. If you go to those similar studies I talked about at the start, people who have done research like ours, this was from Matthias Strelick's group, studied hundreds of books over this same time period, similar types of lab tests. We said all of our books are acidic. His data is showing a completely different conclusion, right? That the books that they were measuring, the book papers that they were measuring prior to 1880 were much more neutral. I think the importance of understanding your collection at this point and how the learnings you're gathering are related to your collection, the uniqueness of your collection. It's something that Jake talked about at the beginning. Understanding what's unique and noteworthy about a collection, that may not match between different studies, right? We can come up with a couple different hypotheses on why, Mattia's group was finding something that was a little bit different from ours in this period of time, but the fact is that these were differences that were measured. So I'm going to pause for a second. There's a lot of plots. probably making your head spin a little bit. I had the luxury of the slow spin over 3 years of trying to make sense of all this mess, and I just threw it at you 20 minutes, condensed, distilled into just kind of a bunch of head spinning. And so I do just want to highlight a couple takeaways at that moment between just these test properties themselves. We could, rapidly identify those compositions using IR. Something I'm selfishly excited about is was, a bare bones tool we had in our lab that, thanks to the Melon Project, we really got to refine that I know we're going to be using more. It may be something that other science labs might be using more. We found that the same quantitative properties, stress at break or pH, each of those could depend on different ways and different compositions. We found that our relationships are not necessarily matching published relationships, even in seemingly similar connections. As much as I really, really wanted to find those direct line connections, this area is good, this area is bad, this year's good, this year's bad, the things we're not finding may be just as useful, right? This is a huge data set, and to say we didn't find evidence of this, of certain things, that might be helpful to people, right? We found that there's no nice and tidy and simple trend lines between our measurements. You have to get a little more complicated to find these relationships. There's no indication from this period that the RAG-based books that we're measuring are any better than the wood pulp-based books. There's no immediate sign that a partner's holding location is related to their current condition at the moment. So hopefully that gives you a taste of the kinds of properties and relationships we've been looking at. I'll come back to correlating different properties in a bit, but I wanted to stop and talk about that unique aspect of this project. How do identical books match compared to each other, right? And Fenella showed a couple of these. I'll show them again, of books that are the matched title, and the infrared data is suggesting that they are made of different things. And so we found that roughly 1 in 4 titles have mismatches of what they're made of from the start. That's on the bolder end of the predictions. There's some, errors inherent in this model. It may drop a little below that, but it's above 10%. More than 1 in 10, your copy might be made of something different than someone else's identical copy. So right from the get-go, it's going to be starting off from a different place of material property than someone else's. Another example, that was just wood, pulp, and rag, but there are some that are even more obvious. There's some that looked glossy, highly calendared even, versus others that did not. So those are pretty easy. You say, this is made of one thing, this other one's made of a different thing, they're different. Defining what's typical, what's matched for a quantitative property is a little more challenging. There are a couple ways you can do this, statistical t-tests, that kind of thing. I'm just gonna walk you through a very simple example using pH. Kudos to Megan and Elizabeth who ran through just mountains of calculations for every variable that we did of those 20 plus. And so what we might do is we might take these books and we say, okay, matched titles, what's the average pH or the average strength or the median value, and I'm actually using medians here, median value of these books, and then you go through each one of the partners' copies and you say this one at a pH of 5.2 compared to everyone else's, is that outside the range of sort of the inherent errors of both natural variation and instrument measurement accuracy? You say, is your copy going to be outside this range? And that's what we'll say that your book is atypical compared to others. And so what I'm doing here, it's kind of a complicated slide, is I'm plotting the odds that any title has an atypical volume within it between partners over time for different properties. Again, I'm just showing you 2 because we have a ton. pH and molecular weight, the degree of polymerization of cellulose, of how often you are going to find some weirdo copy that has different quantitative properties than everyone else's. If that's still a little much, you can get away. It's good enough to think of that y-axis as an assessment of variation. How much variation are there among matched copies at these moments in time? And each variable has its own relationship. The one consistency we see is right around the 1880s. Before that period, all of these quantitative properties, you'll find more unusual copies among the matched sets. After the 1880s, they tend to start converging to similarity. So if you have a copy after 1880 and you want to know how yours compares, your pH compares, your strength compares to someone else's, it's much more likely to be similar to someone else's after that period. We can also do that by partner to say, okay, of the ones that are atypical, how many are coming from Arizona? How many are coming from Cornell? How many, does anyone have more atypical copies compared to someone else? And we don't see that. That distribution is pretty random. You can squint and maybe find some trends, but I don't really think they're there. I think it's pretty random, which again says that there's no relationship between where they're being currently held and what their likelihood of being unusual, whether good or bad, is. So some practical interpretations. What do you take away from what I'm showing you here? You know, there was that comment we were talking about earlier of maybe you just use the worst case. You say, you know, we don't know how typical they are, how atypical they are. We just say, what's the worst case of any of these books? What we'll assume it's the most conservative estimate. You certainly can, and there's no harm in doing that. There may be some additional handles here to say, you know, maybe the worst case you can gauge by period of time. You know, I'm showing period of time, but it may be some of those publisher questions that came up before. The 1880s show marked changes in when those variations start changing. If published before the 1880s, it's not really safe to assume that someone's copy is going to be similar to yours. It's much more likely it's going to be different. After that date, if you're starting to think about how you might make some of these assessments of who's got good copies, your copy is going to have a much higher likelihood of being similar to someone else's. But how do those variations matter? If it's typical, if it's atypical? Again, let's tie this to some kind of wayfinder of what does that mean? If it's, you know, unusual, does it matter that it's unusual? How far above an unusualness threshold do we need to be thinking to say this is a useful metric or not? And we can compare that again to some criteria. I'm just using this degree of polymerization on when paper starts breaking from Matthias Strelick's group, but I'm sure you could think of other criteria that might be useful to consider. And you can see again this 1880s, 1890s is when this cutoff, just as an example calculation, not making any recommendations that anyone use this particular value, but how you might do something like this. And you say, well, before that period, you have a much higher number of these atypical books that are above that criteria. They're quite good. Then there's this weird mishmash of books in the 80s and 90s where, you know, you lose a lot of that value that's above that cutoff. They're all in kind of a mixed bag, and then as they get newer, they start to return to values above that criteria. So what do we do with that, right? I showed you the general test properties. I showed you how they change over time. I've shown you how similar books across the broad spectrum can be, but what about my copy, right? Okay, it's likely that, you know, 1 in 3 is atypical. Is this copy atypical? The one I'm holding, I need to know that's the one. Is this the good one that I don't want to get rid of compared to everyone else's? And that gets to the idea that Fenella talked about of can we, you know, start thinking about which of the properties we measure might even be able to give you a good guess on where yours falls relative to anyone else's. You can try some simple R-squared correlations, just linear pairwise fits of variables. I'll admit they all look pretty lousy. These simple linear fits are not great. The best you can get is kind of these R-squareds, even when you start separating based on what they're made of, you know, 0.3, 0.4, that's nothing I'm going to write home about. But it is enough. Some of them that do get to that range, you say, well, maybe there's something there. Maybe you can start thinking about this as a useful metric. They do depend, again, on what they're made of. There are some maybe mild colorimetric correlations with strength for rag-based papers. They completely disappear by the time you start looking at the wood bulb-based papers. We don't see that correlation exist anymore at all. Why does that matter? Well, if you're using a model based on colorimetric data and you just apply it to any book you have in your hands, it's going to fail, right? It's not going to work because it's not incorporating those informed subdivisions of data. You need those directed sets or groupings to start making informed models. The other challenge here is, right, those were linear fits. The data is clearly nonlinear, right? This is one of our best correlations, and you can see that linear fit line in a very nonlinear relationship that's not very inspiring to look at. And so you can do these multivariate relationships and start teasing apart different variables, how they combine in nonlinear ways. This is that principal component analysis grouping I showed you at the start. You don't need to know what it is other than to know that these are all the samples in a multivariate space. And when I showed it before, I wanted to highlight that you could start grouping these to say, okay, instead of, you know, some criteria of can I use color data to quantitatively predict pH 4.5 to 5.5, oh, that's pretty dicey. But if you can highlight regions of the multivariate space and say, books in this region are in that upper quartile. They're the good ones. Books in this region, they're highlighted in green, apologize for the kind of flipped sensical coloring there, are the lower ones. You say, okay, those are the books in the regions that tend to be on the lowest quartile. You can start seeing some groupings of where the highest quartile tends to be in multivariate space, where the lowest quartile tends to be in multivariate space. And you say, well, maybe we can find some predictive property to just point us in the right direction, a wayfinder of what you can do. And in this case, some of those colorimetric values paired with publication date, because that is tied sort of closely to composition, we've been having some okay luck for predicting books in good condition. You can get a pretty good success rate of predicting just using colorimetric data and a publication date using a least squares discriminant analysis model, if anyone's curious. If that book is in the upper quartile of books relative to its time period, you get about an 80% chance of saying that book's pretty good. The rest of them have some leeway, but that does rely on having an informed model and appreciating the uniqueness of what this collection, the ANC collection that we're studying, is in relationship to perhaps your own collection. So that's the whirlwind of data slides. It's highly complex. The real world is messy. I hope this shows just how, you know, hard it is to find those connections. We were hoping to find the real easy ones. They're just not there. Matched copies are frequently not matched. Even when they look like they might be, about 1 in 4 are just made of different things. The most amount of variation happens before the 1880s. After that, they start becoming much more similar. There are some nonlinear connections that we might be able to provide some predictive analyses. I'm personally pretty excited on how others might use a very large data set like this and bring their own interpretations and tool sets and sort of areas of interest of where, you know, cutoffs and typicality might be useful for them. So I'm going to turn it back over to Fenella to just kind of wrap this part up. Thank you for slogging through that.
And I'm seeing people with like multivariant formulas in their brain, and what if we... So, as we mentioned, and Ian had mentioned, what can we use with that data and come up with that infamous simple tool that replaces the beloved double fold test that everyone adores? So, pandemic was also, you know, that time period where we start like coming up with more acronyms. So the STACK test was, which we had to keep explaining, kind of evolved into collection assessment tools, which some of my staff will probably smile because every staff meeting there was a cat in the Zoom. Cujo is the resident one who I think got the most number of Zoom highlights. That's Andrew's cat. But what we were looking at here was not just to see what did work. We wanted to see what didn't work. And, you know, is there some sort of simple pH that will determine at risk? What spot tests are actually working? We tried all sorts of different things. Sometimes it's like you probably don't want to use sulfuric acid that's probably not a good idea, even though it's quite simple. The bending and drape, that's still really challenging. What's happening with colour correlation? So what we did as part of it, I'm not going to focus so much on what didn't work, but I do want you to know that there was a lot of things that we can now say that really is not useful. But one of the things that was, as Andrew was starting to talk about, the little Nix, that's a colorimeter that Bluetooths to your phone. And you can see, that's my finger, you can see it's not very big. Now we can start to think about once we've got the data, how does that start to work in terms of what we're finding? So our wonderful partners and PRDD staff, we got a collection of paper samples with different properties. We gave them a set of papers that was unlabeled and sent them a Nix, and didn't give them a lot of instructions because we wanted to see how variable it was. And it's like, okay, go ahead and see what you can find with this. So we did have two different types of Nix. One is $99, one is more in the $400-500 range. And we wanted to see, and huge thanks to Amanda here, what was the variation between the same instruments, between the same person with different instruments, more than you really want to know, but basically we have a fairly good idea now of what that variability across those low-cost colorimeters is, starting to look at what the colour space components in terms of yellowness or light dark that will actually potentially align with the slider. As Andrew was saying, we can't definitively say what that number is. We're not going to be able to say 7.2 is the number, but we can start to say low risk, high risk, medium risk, and link that with publisher and other components as we start to go forward. This round robin, what was really interesting is we kind of went from the complexity to the very simple. What if at the end of the day you have someone and you can walk into the stack or into your collections and you need to make decisions on this huge amount of material? If you just take the pH pens, which one's most accurate? So we looked at Abbey, Light Impressions, Linco, and some other ones. And what we're starting to see is that with the combination, for example, the Abbey pen is very good at telling you what's acidic, but it then tends to say, well, it might have a little bit, even though it's not really. The Light Impressions and Linco are better at saying more accurate in the alkaline. So if you take both of those and do a tiny dot on your page, you now have a feel for, with good accuracy, acidity and alkalinity. Because of some of the other questions and outliers we'd seen in various things, we were like, why are we seeing some of these rag papers that are so acidic? And after chatting with Matthias Strelick and some of our advisory panel, we then used the alum pen, and it's like, oh, alum sizing. So those two, and then with some of those other small pens that we're finding good accuracy in, give you a feel for what category of risk you might have in terms of what you're looking at. So a shout out to the over to the side if you didn't have a chance to look earlier. And part of this challenge is, again, having a reference strip where you have different coloured papers. What does this pen look on a brown piece of paper versus a white piece of paper? Because if you don't have something to compare it to, it's really challenging to go, yeah, I know I was talking with Ian, with someone who's like, it was really interesting looking at all these pH pens together because I hadn't really thought about what that meant, looking at the different ones together. Then also a wonderful thing to look at during the pandemic was, how do we visualize this in different ways? And we really are sort of, as we're starting to say, dig into this, how many of the copies coming from Macmillan are more acidic than other ones in this time period? What are the locations, and across, whether it's Europe or the States, we're starting to see stronger or not strong books because of the paper types they might have been bringing in these time periods. Apologies. This is just for you to see that, are these specific years that are starting to step out and stand out? We're looking to see how best to visualize some of these types of things we're seeing and how they might be able to be used with some of the components. And this is the slide that is just like, there's a lot going on. So one last example I wanted to show is, this is the letters of John III, and what you're seeing in those 4 copies on the right, the exact same gatherings of papers, which you might say, and, well, we were pretty excited because we didn't see that a lot. And so this was one of the unique examples we had where we saw the exact same groupings. And what does this mean? So as you've been starting to hear, this means that those things have aged the same over time. Those 2 paper types have been together. And what we're seeing is that original property of the paper is the one that's having the most impact, because people would have pulled paper types and assuming at the time they would have looked pretty similar, but over time they've actually changed. And so we're seeing with the preservation of large physical collections that that impact of the material is incredibly important for us going forward with making those decisions about, you know, what is a less, you know, a better quality type material. So in terms of research impact, we've really improved and increased the understanding of the paper-based general collections in this period type. And just a huge thank you to the partners for some of our discussions about distinct, unique and distinctive collections. Here at the Library of Congress, we have special collections and it's 1812 and before. But in talking, we realised, in fact, that the usefulness of this data for this time period is very informative. Is it hip hop? Is it, you know, someone who has to collect all of the congressional materials from that area? Is it the Cuban Heritage Center? These types of materials from smaller, more unique collection types, or less well, you know, the paper material was not as easy for them to get high quality materials, are collections that we really want to target and think about as we think about what should be preserved from these materials. We're starting to look, as you're hearing, that what is that data-backed guideline synopsis that we can start to pull together if this publisher in this time period and also really coming back to some of the collections demography work. This information is, we're looking at an aggregate, but what does that mean for your institutional collection? You should be taking charge for your data to go, you know what, this is a really important part of our research collection, and we now know based on this, we will keep 3 copies and or regardless of what else is out there. So really starting to take this back to the institutional level for people to make decisions of what they know about that. So just an overview, just to recap, that active data set was just critical for us to be able to keep adding data, to reinterrogate, to go back and look at new relationships, being able to start to identify those periods at risk, what those trends are or are not, where they start to shift and how they relate to material types, making sure that we've thought about our data before we started the project so that, as Andrew had said, who else can use this data? There's so many components of this that can be pulled out for different aspects. And being able to, you know, mine this data for, think about what's there and what those correlations are for different collections. This could not have been done, and it gives me great joy to share, and my apologies if I have left someone off. I spent about 2 hours on the weekend trying to pull names, but so many people have been involved with this. Even at the partners, you know, they were off campus and being able to send their staff in. I mean, they talk about it taking a village. There are so many people, so many PITD staff. I mean, I can't thank you enough. It's just incredible what we managed to do. And just a huge thank you again to Dr. Don Waters, Dr. Patricia Sway, and our colleagues at the Mellon Foundation, who are really supportive and adaptable for helping us get through and work with us as things were challenging through the pandemic. Library of Congressional Development staff and LCSG staff. The next slide. Our interns go back to 2015. Without these interns, some of the early work to look at some of the miniaturization, and then all of these people, it was just phenomenal. I was quite astounded when I realized how many people worked on this. It was also exciting to think about some of our folks coming in for the first time, and they're like, but paper's just our paper's not just paper. It was just amazing to be able to share that knowledge and get them all excited about that. So I just want to take a moment to thank everyone who's been involved, and it's been phenomenal, and everyone will. I already have told the partners that this is actually a long-term, it's a 20-year project, so that they'll. I did tell you that, right? Again, if you could join me in thanking all of my staff, the partners, all of the researchers, it's just, we could thank them for all of their work. It's just been amazing. Now it gets really interesting, the questions and answers. So if we could just take 5 minutes, we just need to do a little bit of a rearrangement. I just asked the partners and some of the researchers to come up and grab a seat, take a quick toilet break, and then we will take questions and answers and the panel discussion. So we'll just take a few moments. Welcome to the question and answer green light session and the panel, where the partners are going to impart pearls of wisdom, they told me. Do we have any questions, comments, thoughts? I see Chris moving towards the microphone. And because of our online, we still have close to 100 online, so there are microphones moving, or there is one to the front. So if you have a question from the audience, if you wouldn't mind speaking into the microphone, that would be great, or I can repeat it. So we'll go with Patty. There's one over here, if you don't mind. Chris will grab it.
So is it on? Yeah. So my question is about the tensile testing of Andrews and whether you've looked at strain to failure in your measurements, as that's a typical material science test for failure, and I'm wondering if you've looked at that term.
Not to any extent that I think you mean by strain to failure. So that's of all the tensile properties we're measuring, the strain value that we're measuring is the one strain at break, which is, yep. And I haven't done any particular correlations to that, haven't checked that terribly closely any more than any of the others.
This one's actually this one's a two-parter. So we start with what happened or stopped in or around 1880s in paper making or printing that could possibly explain the move from more variable to less variable. That's part one, and then we'll get to part two after you answer that.
So the quick answer is, in terms of paper production, around 1870 is when they really did start to use the paper pulp. It came in the 1840s, but around the 1870s, when you look at some of the patents, that's really when they're starting to use it more consistently. So that's the short, quick answer for that.
Okay, and then following on that, we also know from banknotes, which are high rag content, that banknotes with shorter fiber lengths as opposed to chain length do not wear as well as those with longer fiber lengths. I'm not even going to suggest microscopic analysis, but perhaps low-angle laser light scattering could be useful.
Yeah, I agree. Fiber length is definitely something that influences strength properties. It's not something that we could very quickly add to all the other bevy of tests that we're doing. It would really be interesting to check, and I think we have a lot of the sample remainders where we could quantify that, but I'm thinking of how much time that's going to add over how many samples. Interesting technical question for sure, to which I agree.
Hi, also, this is for Andrew, really. In some ways, it's not surprising that when you look at a lot more data, when you have a lot more data, your models start to fall apart. But I think you were going here. I just wanted to kind of see if this is what you were saying, which is that I think there's a general idea that is well accepted that yellowness pretty much correlates to paper decreasing in strength and other properties. And I guess that was mostly based on the Barra data. So it sounded like you were hedging towards that, but you didn't say it in those words. Did this study, with all this extra data, really pull that apart, or is it still in line with that idea?
In terms of yellowness, I feel I am both more and less confident that yellowness is an indicator of condition. I think, and we were talking about this, I forget which call we were talking about yellowness of different types of papers. The challenge is that, so yeah, everything else being equal, as paper ages, it yellows, but once you factor in lignin and yellowing due to all the chemical reactions that can occur with lignin, that's my guess, my hypothesis, why that starts being a challenge in those papers that have lots of lignin in them. That's why those correlations perhaps seemed a little better for the rag-based papers. They don't have that yellowing component in them, so that yellowness is probably a little more related to true aging rather than other chemical reactions simultaneously going on. That's my guess. I have no idea.
Okay.
So,
But, lignin papers are going to be more degraded.
are going to be, I'm sorry?
More degraded with the lignin content.
Potentially.
I think the thing is that with the lignin papers, as the lignin ages, it gets yellow itself. That may not be the reason or the factor that it becomes weaker. So it could get yellow before it gets weak, and that's a complicating factor. And without putting words in Andrew's mouth too much, my interpretation of what he was saying was the yellowness based on the lignin could be washing out, or at least over,
Yeah. Which is a good argument for your, let's compare apples to apples and keep only looking at the two types as separate groups.
Which is a shame, because it would be so lovely. If it was just
No,
this one
I
thing,
mean,
the
actually
yellowness is
simplifies
good.
things. I think it's a good approach.
but
Yeah,
it's-
yeah. Thanks.
One thing I just wanted to bring up, was one of the points Andrew had made was that we see this sort of convergence to 1880, sort of following on a little bit from the question, and after that, things are more likely to be more like their other ones. However, correct me if I'm wrong, but we are seeing a broader range after 1880, so that they might be more likely to be similar, but the range of what that 75% is at one point appeared to be broad.
I don't
somewhat.
think so, but I think it depends on the variable. I'd have to double check.
Okay.
I don't know offhand.
Frankie, please.
Thanks. This was a question specifically for you, Andrew, again. Sorry for picking on you.
I feel like the popular boy at the party. I want to hear what you guys want to talk about.
Well, this is specifically about a couple of your slides when you had the slide titled Define Typical Books and Conditions for the box and whisker plots for, I want to say, pH and tensile strength, especially with Australic data as well. You had red lines that were different from the mean, and I was going to ask what those red lines meant.
Those are the medians. I think the red lines were the averages.
Gotcha.
So mostly they show the median. So when it's just the black lines, that's the median value.
Gotcha.
Occasionally you can put the averages, you can decide to put the averages in too. Tells you something about the distribution of the data when the average differs from the mean, but that's what those are.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Chris, any other?
Yeah, we have a few more. So there is interest in the correlations between the publishers, the materials, and current condition. Will and how will this data be available to researchers outside the project?
So that's one of the topics that will be part of our discussion tomorrow, and we've really been thinking hard and trying to look at how to create those. We've moved away from decision making, away from matrix, to more thinking about guidelines and how we actually pull that information out. And sometimes it might be like a decision tree, if and or, and that's what we have been looking at. What's the best way to share that? As you heard from Ian, we've got the catalogue data that we're really starting to go, what's easily accessible to people now that we've been able to analyse this large data set and take it back. So that's a little bit of a non-answer, but we're still looking at what the best way of doing that sort of guideline decision-making component will be.
So the raw data itself will be available.
Correct.
So that will include the bibliographic data, it will include all the test data, and that would, I mean, we'll have analyzed data also hopefully online on the similar tool, but the raw data itself should have the publisher data and all of the other data in there. So if people want to wade through it, they can also wade through it.
Okay, we also have, does the data provide any observable patterns on paper sizing, types of sizing versus data or fiber type, and any relationship with deterioration?
No. We didn't measure that. We didn't measure that. I don't have any confidence in saying anything about that. It's a good question, though.
We did it in early stages.
That's true. That is.
We did in early stages look, like, is it gelatin or starch? As most people in the room know, you starch on cellulose is cellulose. So we could tell things like gelatin sizing, and we did look, but in terms of something that was going to be definitive and really pull out and pop out a new trend, it wasn't something that, as I said, that the alum was one that popped out nicely, but a lot of those test methods, it was just too much time throughout the project but to do those subjective tests. I'm looking down to the staff in the back. Amanda's about to crawl under a seat, but we do still have those fragments, as Andrew said before, and the thought is we can go back and do those, which we have done every time we see something new. So that is something that could be followed up on.
And we also had interest in if fungal testing should be included in this sort of assessment.
So we quarantined, I don't see Andrew, I think we quarantined maybe 2 books, Robin. So throughout all of these, we have not seen significant evidence of fungal infestation. We looked at what the covers and or throughout the book looked like, but it was only 2 books that from the entire 2,500 that actually got pulled out of that. I'm assuming the partners, if they were wet and a bit manky, they probably didn't send them to us. But we did not, as I said, there was only 2 specific examples of that. So while that could be a factor, given that all of our partners, let me say this, definitely, as well as the current esteemed location, has known environmental control that's usually more than, most of them have walls as well, right?
I think at least 2 of them did.
At least 2 of them have walls. So it just did not seem to be a significant factor in the collection that we were looking at.
A couple more questions came in. In terms of the visual and non-invasive assessments, were some measurements taken at different locations across the sheets? And if so, were there any apparent trends?
Thank you. I realised that there was one thing we just kind of skipped over because we'd spent a lot of time. So Andrew Forsberg can talk to that. Short answer is yes. When we started, we were a little bit maniacal. We did the gutter, the centre across. We still continue to do that with the IR and the fours. We did not see, one of the again, another rabbit hole. We'd sort of hoped, I had naively hoped that if the edges were yellowing, that we'd have this really quick way to say, hey, look, it's more acidic, woohoo. Then we found that some books get trimmed, so they look really good, but they're more acidic because they trimmed off the yellowing edge. So we did continue to do that. We did not see significant difference across the page for the full, well, I'll let Andrew jump into that. But yes, there were multiple locations taken.
I'm sorry, I had a minor child emergency to attend to. I missed the question, but it sounds like for now.
Were multiple locations taken for IR and FORS?
Oh, yes. For IR, for the sake of redundancy, in case there was any error, we took 2 measurements, one from the edge and then another one at inset, as a sanity check. And for, as Penelope was saying, for FORS, I took one from near the top edge, where discoloring was most likely to occur as close to the edge as we could without scattering from light affecting it. And then inset where the yellowing or whatever other outside edge effect might be least without capturing print, obviously, because that's going to change the color profile, everything else. And then from the gutter, one of the fun things I heard Fenella mentioning as well was trimming, in which case all bets are off in terms of edge yellowing, because you are now dealing with a paper that at some stage was cut. When you can't even begin to guess when it was rebound likely, but when that happened. Other factors, sometimes you would think the gutter would be the least affected, but depending on the binding, it could be even more yellow than anywhere else. I would also take IR and FORS, because they're quick measurements for pages that we were not going to be physically analyzing, because we couldn't warrant it. There weren't enough pages, but I still felt they're important enough to keep track of, record of, for various reasons, such as plates and any sort of special deterioration on plates and books. And in this case, yellowing quite frequently occurred not around the edges, but inset. So the edges would be quite almost ivory colored, but then they would grow like a halo inside it. It's more yellow, creamy. And that was often associated with the foxing that you saw in some of those photos this morning that Amanda took photos of. So there are a whole lot of factors. In the data platform, to try to account for this, every type of delta E calculation is possible, and you can do it between whichever of the 3 positions you like to another one in either direction, because some of those equations are not reversible. Well, not, yeah. And yeah, there's a lot there to try to work through if someone was wanting to get a really solid handle on it. But it is very messy, and there are many factors depending on how the book has been treated and the composition of it. That was
Yeah, and there's another research paper, but Andrew also did a lot of work on various components across the page, between pages, so we probably don't have time to go into that today, but that will be published as well. And we'll just take a few more questions, and I just want to make sure the partners have time to talk as well.
These last 3. In terms of finding that the majority of papers are acidic, is it known whether these papers started out as acidic, or is the acidity a consequence of the aging?
It's a really good question. If we had taken the data like 150 years ago, we could answer that question. We have a small selection in our reference collection where we have that data. I don't know if you want to talk briefly about Barrow.
Yeah, about 30 seconds, I'll say. We have a high school intern, actually, who is currently working with the Barrow books that we have in our lab, taking new acidity measurements compared to the acidity measurements taken 60 years ago, so how much acidity is changing over time. And the preliminary data, we're not done yet, is that it's not changing terribly much. It's not.
So this might be a question for the conservators. I'm pretty sure that paper production, especially with the lum sizing, started out as acidic.
It's more acidic.
No? Maybe.
Maybe?
More acidic.
More acidic. And then in the 80s, I believe, there was a change to non-acidic paper production.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, because there was, historically, there was, and I'm a conservator, but this is not my best specialty here. But I do remember there were like discussions during that period of like, we have a problem with our books becoming acidic and brittle, so it was already a known problem then, like in the turn of the century. And then, yeah, and then later, you know, we switched to more alkaline paper just as the default to begin with. So yeah, I think you're correct.
And we did also try to see, like, is there an alum pen that would be helpful? You could not really distinguish between the sizing and if there was, you know, aluminum in the paper, so it wasn't something that we could use to identify the sizing effectively.
And if I recall correctly also, I think especially in the 19th century, they were doing all types of chemical stuff to the wood to break it down and to be able to make it into a fiber itself. So I think that it started off acidic. I don't have that data in front of me, and I'm not an expert in that area.
Okay. Let's see. Was there any note made regarding the general environment? That is, was the city/location of the contributing partners located in heavily industrial areas over their time of existence/collecting?
So we didn't look at pollution as part of this study. I'll let the partners talk, but none of the areas were in heavily polluted areas, and most of them are actually pretty nice.
Yeah, Phoenix was marketed in the early 20th century as like a place where you would go to breathe easier, you know. So I think our pollution issues have come in much later. Yeah.
We sort of, well, generally about environment, we did have one of our wonderful interns look at the NOAA data and like how that related to the building data. The problem is NOAA keeps shifting their location, so suddenly what was close is now 50 miles away, which, as all of us know from the storm last night, can change markedly within 10 to 20 miles. So, but we did start to look at teasing out some of those components, but pollution was not something that we were taking into the impact here.
All right, and the last question. This was asked earlier. If the double fold number doesn't correlate with the tensile strength, what physical property or properties does it correlate with?
Would you like to take that one, Robin?
There was no trend.
There was absolutely no trend with every single thing that we tried to look at.
We're terribly sorry to have to share that with you, but we tried hard. But you know, in terms of a consistent trend, it wasn't there. So, are there any other questions from the audience? I'd just love to give our partners a chance to talk a little bit about their experience. Was there someone from the back? No? Okay. Frankie?
Thank you. How has COVID impacted your collaboration? Do you think it's facilitated communication, or do you think it's been a detriment to the project and the timeline?
I think it strengthened our collective will to do this. It's stretched our capacity, but I'm going to let the partners take that one. Hilary.
I will say that I think it helped that we were all kind of remote from each other to begin with. So a lot of the systems that we were using to communicate, we just continued doing so. It was interesting to see, based on institution, our access to these collections to be able to send them was markedly different from each other. So originally we had a schedule for shipment based that we would rotate from institution to institution, and that needed to shift depending on who had access to collections. I know for CU Boulder, one of the benefits is that a lot of the collections we were sending were stored in an off-site facility they're circulating collections, but it's not accessible by the public. So they were able to have staff on site for most of the time that our libraries were mostly shut down to the public. And so when I was able to be on site, they were still able to send me collections to get to them. So that was nice. But yeah, it was very interesting to hear how it went for other partners as well.
I think it went very similarly at Cornell. I could feel the challenges from the LC side in getting things to and from the right places. It's a bigger organization with a lot more considerations in place as far as workflows. But for us, I do think it strengthened overall our understanding and the output of the project, because we did learn a lot more about our own cataloging and our own metadata throughout this process. At Cornell, I can speak for Cornell anyway. So as part of that, we also implemented a brand new ILS system during this project. So being able to query and find out new things in a new system that we helped develop and implement in Folio required some rapid shifts on the part of our person who handles all those queries. So as we were working with this person from the outset, we had designed something, and of course, we learned a lot about that data throughout the course of this. The shipment slowing down for a period of time allowed us to sort of, make some adjustments locally for ourselves in pulling this material.
Stephanie, I know you're patiently with us remotely. I know you had quite a different experience with Washington. You were shut down for quite a while. Do you want to talk to that?
Sure, I can speak to that. In fact, I'll just say I think the team was really remarkable in adapting. At University of Washington in Seattle and in Washington State, we were pretty locked down for a long time. And we're not allowed to go into our collections and our buildings. Just had one facilities manager on site. And so we had to send Library of Congress everything, multiple shipments towards the end once we were able to get back on site. So, and I think it's a testament to the fact of everyone's adaptability that I'm able to join you today because I couldn't travel because I've had 2 direct exposures to COVID within the past 5 days. And so, but the team has been really wonderful in managing to include me despite that.
So just on a practical side, I think one of the questions was, what did it do for timeline? It certainly extended the timeline of the project, no doubt. On the communication side, I think there were things that we had to learn how to do better. So initially, we had planned to actually meet a lot more often in person than what we did. And we just weren't able to do that because of a lot of the restrictions we were going through. So we found ways in order to make that work. But it would have been nice. I think actually there are some things that would have been a little bit more easy if we were able to meet a little bit more often in person.
All right.
Do partners want to talk, takeaways? I know you were talking about, getting questions from others after, we'd sort of talked more and met. Were there sort of questions from within the institutions of, what are you doing? Or why are you doing this? Or anyone?
At the University of Miami, I think we did an okay job, but we had some changes in personnel. Our head of access services was very engaged at the beginning of the project, but then he left the university, and so we sort of had to go back and bring people up to speed. And then, of course, the pandemic hit, and that set everything back. But slowly but surely, and I thank Martha Horan for actually keeping track of all this, we were able to get the books organized and find the missing ones. We had, of course, much more of a complication because I think something like 26%, was it, books we couldn't actually find in our stacks. It was because 22% had actually been relocated to FLAIR, which is the Florida Academic Repository, which is actually run by the University of Florida. So the University of Florida became an extra partner in all of this. But it worked out. I think you got most of the materials that have been transferred to their management. So. And sometimes I believe some of the copies were actually from the University of Florida's collection originally, rather than the University of Miami. But if it served the purpose, I guess that was okay. All that material had been in Florida for some time. So
I would say that I didn't have anyone ask me like why do we need to do this? Possibly because when my boss and my boss's boss, the collections team is really great, and they understand that there are different ways to use our collection that are viable, that aren't just somebody checking it out. So yeah, I think it was just sort of reassuring everyone involved in the logistics part that it's like we don't need to pull all of these books by tomorrow. You know, do it as you can, especially given COVID happening. But I think the other thing that helped was also knowing that these books were chosen because they are commonly held. So if somebody really needed to access that book, there were other ways to get access to that text through ILL or Haudi or whatever. So yeah, it was pretty smooth sailing for us. And I would be happy to send more. Yeah, because I think most of these actually, the other thing too is I think we provided some circ data, and a lot of them were like they hadn't circulated in 20 years, kind of sadly, or so it was just nice to see them get another chance at, in the sun.
Not to put you on the spot, Susie, but I remember chatting with you at one point, and after volumes came back to you, there was some deduping, and you're like, oh, we've just withdrawn, right? Is that?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, and we had, for some of these books, we had 3 copies. So I did try to send the extras when I found them. But it was an interesting kind of process to think about, all right, normally in our preservation workflow, we don't work on things unless they've been used by a patron. So had it not been for this project, these probably would have not been touched for another 20 years, So yeah, it was, I did, when some things came back, especially when it was like a duplicate or a triplicate, there was some did not go back permanently necessarily. But we did our best to, fix them up before they went back to storage or wherever. But yeah.
I just have to tell one more example, and Kelly, if Kelly's still here, will smile. There was one book from Arizona that was heavily taped together, and Kelly came in because there's this big note in it, and it said, "I didn't do this, Susie."
Yeah, it was. I took pictures of it, and I think we might have withdrawn that, but when we withdrew it, I was like, please send it back to the lab because it's an excellent example of a previous repair. It had termite damage, and somebody had helpfully taped over all the holes through the pages. But there was another typed note on the front cover from one of the library staff that said, we are retaining as is, which means that they knew it had this and they still kept it anyway. Because at that point, I guess that was, we couldn't access that content as easily as we could today. So the termite copy was still worth keeping, yeah.
Megan.
This is just a curiosity question. While the Library of Congress has had these books and been testing on them, have any students come forward at your libraries and requested them, and then you had to say, no, they're in Washington, D.C.?
No.
For us, when something has, like when in the system, when it says it's in preservation, I think it's, and this was from COVID era, but I think it's still in place. It can't be requested. So somebody would at the Circ desk would have to email me and go, hey, do you have this book? So yeah, in this case, they would just send them to ILL, I think. But I would also just short answer, no.
We're kind of the same as Arizona in that people couldn't request it when we had it checked out, but we did have 2 books that I was unable to send because they were checked out, and I think one had like 15 renewals, and even though I put a hold on it for it to come back, it never showed up. So, yeah.
So we have one more question real quick. Do we know if any of these books have been through the mass deacidification treatment process?
Yes. Yes, some of them have. Do you want to take that one, Robin? Short answer is we... Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, when they came in, most of them had a mark on them that said they had gone through the process and like what year it happened. But also you could feel that they had gone through the process. Like your hands felt a little soapy afterwards if you weren't wearing gloves.
When you say most of them, you mean most of the ones that had gone through deacidification, not that most of the books had been deacidified.
Correct.
Yeah, and there was a fairly small number. We did not see a distinctive difference in the acidity between deacidified and non-deacidified books from that time period in the selection that we tested.
So I just had one comment. Andrew is very apologetic about not finding trends overall. I am less apologetic about that. I think that these types of studies, one of the things that we're trying to figure out is, are there predictions we can make? And I think it is actually a really important finding that it is very difficult to do, and how messy some of this data is. So I'm not apologetic, I'm not sorry that we didn't find some of these trends that we were kind of hoping for. And I think it allows us to kind of make some, to throw away some of the assumptions that we previously had and make some decisions based on what do we know that we don't know. Some of these things about publishers and stuff is really interesting. Generally, that's not going to come up in different copies because those would be under different bibliographic records. But it may allow us to start saying these types of things overall are at higher risk because we either have fewer copies of them, or they're all going to be really, really bad, or some of them might be a little bit less bad. And I think that's important for us to keep in mind. So I'm actually, and I apologize for my lack of, but I'm really excited by the data that we've gotten out of this.
Yeah, I think that's the takeaway I'm most excited about too, or it feels almost like a relief. It's like a shattering of some commonly held preservation lore, almost, where it's like I just had these assumptions that, we have been told over the years that, oh, if it's like this, then it's also like this. And this is sort of a good way for us to start rethinking, like, well, how do we make these decisions? And maybe we should think about different things other than just how easily the corner folds, or that if everything's acidic, then we don't necessarily need to waste time testing everything with a pH pen because it's just going to say it's acidic. So I don't know, it's been shocking, but also kind of a relief.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I think also one of the things, I guess to some of our apologies, is trying to confront those accepted assumptions that are so deeply ingrained. And, the double fold was one. I remember the first time I had to stand in front of an audience and kind of gulped, and there was sort of this gasp, and it's like, I'm just like, the people are like, well, what are you going to replace it with? Because that's the challenge, right? If you take something away, you've got to be able to replace it. I think actually having a better idea about what's actually going on is, as Susie said and Ian said, it's a relief. Now this is off the table. I know, it's just chatting with Jake earlier, it's like, what don't we need to worry about anymore, but what can we tease out of that? If we find publisher X in this time period, regardless of the books we saw as generally really poor quality, can we start to alert people to some of those things? Jake, did you want to?
Well, yeah, I want to sort of throw this back to the partners in a sense and pick up, maybe bring some of our lunch discussion back to the audience here. If we start thinking about preservation and shared collections in a world where everything is so different that it's sort of similar, right? That there's no particular trend or risk that we can pin. We need to just treat everything as though it's possibly the worst case. And how does that help us start to rethink what the goals of a shared print program are and what national preservation goals are at scale? And I guess I'm also trying to tease out from you, for your own libraries and for the National Library and Counterpoint, are there other priorities in preservation we need to think of? Fenella and I and some of our collections folks have talked about particular topical areas where maybe if we've relieved this one burden, it frees us up to start looking at preservation in tandem with other factors. Have we preserved the publishers of this region? Have we preserved a topic of importance? And can we sort of rethink how we invest our energy?
So I'd be remiss, and Fenella's going to smack me on this. I don't know that we have 100% killed the double fold, as much as most of us would like to. So a couple things with it. Double folds were not done in continuous scales, which we kind of looked at as a continuous scale. It also is done in order to look at fold endurance as compared to tensile strength. We were looking at to see whether or not things could be bound and whether or not they are at risk at loss when they were being used during that kind of fold. I don't love it, and I'm not saying that it has a correlation more than anything else, but we didn't find strong correlations on anything, really. So I think that we have to look at the data and we have to kind of see what's there a little bit before we totally shut the door on it. I think that if we found something, it would be very, very weak. And it really wouldn't tell you a lot about how the book is going to be used or where it's going to go. To your question on what is this, where do we go from here and what does it say about shared print? Again, I think from my side what it says is we may have some better understanding of what may be at higher risk, not on copies, but on areas, and where we might have some scarcity that we need to be worrying about more so. So that is kind of looking at the collections as a whole as compared to saying, what is the generalization for a particular title.
And I think, just tiny bit about the double fold, just to make Ian feel better. I think the concern was, having talked to people in various institutions, and I won't name any of them, people were making decisions on instant withdrawal of fairly rare materials based on a not highly, most people who are doing that are fairly, they know, all of us working with paper, you feel the paper, you have a good feel for it. And I think the concern was if that withdrawal decision is being made by someone who isn't more thoughtful about the material, then you have a challenge. And so I agree.
Absolutely. So I think that people who work with paper every day have put away the double fold and have better ways of doing that, 100%.
I'll hold a convening on double folds and
do a blind test. It is at 4. I just want to thank, unless, does anyone else have any other comments to bring up? No. I just want to firstly thank you all for coming. It was a long day. I want to thank all of my staff for all of the effort they've put into it. A huge thanks to the multimedia team and all of our runners. Thank you for making so much of this work with a few challenges. Stephanie, thank you for hanging with us throughout the day. We have tea, coffee and snacks in the side room, so we'd love to take our conversation into the side room and chat with you all. So I would just again like to thank all of the partners for being here. We're looking forward to doing a deep dive further, and you all for attending, and a huge thank you to those of you online who are stuck with us and such wonderful questions. So thank you all, and we look forward to chatting further.